The sun dipped low over the bustling town of Willowbrook, painting the sky in hues of amber and gold, its fading light stretching long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. The streets thrummed with the heartbeat of a city. Alva footsteps clattered against the sidewalks. Voices rose and fell in a symphony of conversation, and the distant rumble of traffic pulsed like a steady drum. Amid this vibrant chaos walked Charlotte, a woman whose quiet strength seemed to ripple through the air around her. She carried herself with an effortless grace, her dark eyes fixed ahead, her steps deliberate and unhurried. Around her neck gleamed a delicate golden chain, catching the last rays of daylight, a simple adornment that whispered elegance and held a story far deeper than its modest shine suggested. It was a gift from her husband, David, a token of a love forged through years of trust and resilience, a silent promise she wore close to her heart. Charlotte's thoughts wandered as she navigated the crowded street, her mind a private sanctuary untouched by the clamor surrounding her. She didn't notice the patrol car parked just off the curb, its engine idling with a low growl, nor the figure slouched against it, cradling a styrofoam coffee cup. Officer Jack Grant's sharp eyes tracked her every move from beneath the brim of his cap. He'd been stationed here for hours, the monotony of the day gnawing at him, leaving his patience threadbare. Jack was a man hardened by years on the force, his worldview shaped by suspicion and a rigid belief in his own authority. He'd seen countless faces pass through these streets unnervous, some defiant, but Charlotte's calm indifference stirred something in him, a flicker of irritation he couldn't quite place. She didn't flinch at the sight of his uniform, didn't cast a wary glance his way, didn't offer the subtle deference he'd grown accustomed to. To Jack, her confidence felt like a challenge, a quiet rebellion that pricked at his pride. He straightened, his coffee cup abandoned on the hood of the car, and called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "Hey, you." The words were brusque, laced with an edge of command. Charlotte paused mid-step, her body turning slowly to face him, her expression unruffled though a faint crease of annoyance flickered across her brow. "Yes, officer," she replied, her tone steady, measured, betraying no hint of alarm. Jack strode toward her, his boots thudding against the pavement, his gaze zeroing in on the golden chain that glimmered against her skin. "That necklace," he said, his voice sharp, almost accusing. "Where'd you get it?" Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind registering the absurdity of the question. "It's mine," she answered, her words calm but firm, like a river smoothing over stones. "Is there a problem?" Jack's lips twitched, a smirk threatening to break through. "Looks expensive." He pressed, ignoring her question entirely. His eyes raked over her, taking in her simple yet poised demeanor, his suspicion hardening into something uglier. "You sure it's yours? You match the description of someone involved in a theft around here." The accusation landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of murmurs through the growing cluster of onlookers. Heads turned, footsteps slowed, and a few curious souls lingered, drawn by the unfolding drama. Charlotte stood her ground, her posture unwavering, though inside, a quiet storm brewed. She could feel the weight of his words pressing against her chest, the sting of their implication sinking deep. "This chain," she said, her voice steady as steel, "was a gift from my husband. I've done nothing wrong." Jack's smirk widened, his arms folding across his chest with a casual arrogance. "That's what they all say," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. "You don't exactly look like someone who'd own a piece like that." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with prejudice, a judgment rooted not in evidence, but in the color of her skin, and the assumptions he'd carried for far too long. Her jaw tightened, a flare of anger sparking in her chest, but Charlotte refused to let it consume her. She'd faced moments like this before, forcible slights, pointed looks, the quiet erosion of dignity, but she'd learned to armor herself with composure. "Are you accusing me of something, officer?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to carry a challenge. Jack stepped closer, his broad frame looming over her, his presence a deliberate attempt to intimidate. "I'm doing my job," he said coldly, his breath fogging faintly in the cooling air. "And my job is to question things that don't add up. That necklace, it doesn't add up." Charlotte exhaled slowly, steadying the tremble of frustration that threatened to shake her resolve. "If you think I've committed a crime," she said, each word deliberate. "You're mistaken. I don't owe you an explanation for something that's rightfully mine." The tension between them thickened, a taut wire stretched to its limit. The crowd swelled, their murmurs growing louder, their phones raised like silent witnesses to a scene that felt all too familiar. Jack noticed the attention, but didn't relent. His pride was at stake now, his authority dangling by a thread he refused to let snap. "Show me some ID," he demanded, his voice hard, unyielding. Charlotte hesitated, her mind racing as she weighed her options. She could feel the eyes of the onlookers boring into her, the weight of their judgment mingling with Jack's baseless scrutiny. Compliance might end this standoff, but it would also mean bending to an injustice she couldn't stomach. "I don't need to show you anything unless you have a legitimate reason to stop me," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, firm and unshaken. Jack's eyes darkened, his frustration boiling over, spilling into his words. "Listen," he said, his tone laced with a thinly veiled threat. "I can make this easy, or I can make it difficult. Your choice." She met his gaze without flinching, her heart pounding, but her exterior a fortress of calm. "I know my rights, officer," she said softly, yet with a strength that seemed to echo beyond them. "And I won't be intimidated into giving them up." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The crowd held its breath. Jack's hand hovered over his radio, his thoughts a tangled mess of anger and indecision. "You think you're above questioning?" he snapped, his voice rising. "You think you can just strut around like you own this place?" Charlotte's response was swift, her words piercing through his bluster. "No, officer," she said, her tone sharp and clear. "But I do think I deserve to walk these streets without being harassed for no reason." Jack took another step forward, his shadow swallowing the light around her, his towering frame a wall of authority meant to break her will. But Charlotte didn't waver. Her resolve was a quiet fire, burning steady and fierce. Before Jack could press further, a voice sliced through the tension, deep and commanding, resonating with an authority that made the air shift. "What's going on here?" Jack whirled around, his bravado faltering as his eyes landed on the figure striding toward them. David stood a few feet away, his crisp police captain's uniform gleaming under the streetlights, his broad shoulders and steady gaze radiating a quiet power that instantly reshaped the scene. Charlotte's heart lifted at the sight of him, though she kept her composure intact, her face a mask of calm dignity. Jack, however, faltered, his confidence crumbling like dry earth underfoot. "Captain," he stammered, his voice losing its edge. David's eyes flicked to Charlotte, a fleeting tenderness softening his stern expression, before settling back on Jack with an intensity that demanded answers. "Care to explain why you're stopping my wife?" The words hit Jack like a thunderclap, his mouth opening and closing as he scrambled for a response that wouldn't come. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the revelation rippling through them like a shockwave. She matched a description," Jack mumbled, his voice barely audible, his earlier swagger dissolving into a feeble excuse. David stepped closer, his presence towering yet composed, his tone measured but carrying the weight of unspoken reproach. "Is that so?" he said, his eyes boring into Jack's. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're making baseless assumptions, and in front of a crowd, no less." Jack's face flushed, his jaw clenching as he glanced at the onlookers, their phones still capturing every moment, then back at David. "I was doing my job," he said, his defiance a weak flicker against the storm of David's authority. David's gaze narrowed, his voice low but cutting. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass citizens based on flimsy suspicions. My wife doesn't owe you anything, least of all her dignity." Jack's shoulders slumped, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. He wanted to argue, to claw back some semblance of control, but the weight of David's presence and the crowd's growing scrutiny pinned him in place. "Fine," he muttered, stepping back, his retreat a begrudging surrender. "She's free to go." David didn't move until Jack slunk back to his patrol car, his frustration etched into every stiff movement. The crowd began to disperse, their whispers lingering in the air like echoes of a lesson unfolding. Charlotte let out a slow breath, the adrenaline draining from her veins, leaving a quiet resolve in its wake. David turned to her, his stern facade softening into concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a gentle anchor in the storm. She nodded, her composure unbroken. "I'm fine," she said, though her eyes held a spark of something deeper anger. Yes, but also determination. "But this isn't over." David glanced back at Jack's retreating figure, his jaw tightening with a promise of reckoning. "No," he said firmly, his voice a vow. "It's not." Across the street, an older woman lingered, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her weathered hands clutching a grocery bag. She'd watched the entire exchange, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She'd lived in Willowbrook her whole life, seen its streets shift and its people change. But moments like this still cut her deep. She muttered to herself, shaking her head as she shuffled away, her faith in justice bruised, but not broken. Nearby, a teenage boy lowered his phone, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and outrage. He'd captured it all, already thinking of the caption he'd pair with the video, a call to action, a spark to ignite something bigger. For Charlotte, the encounter was more than a clash with one man. It was a mirror held up to a system flawed and fraying at the edges. Jack's actions weren't just a personal failing, they were a symptom of a deeper rot, a misuse of power that thrived in the shadows of unchecked bias. And as David's hand brushed hers, a silent reassurance, she knew this moment would ripple outward, a stone cast into a pond whose waves would demand accountability. Justice, she thought, wasn't just a word, it was a fight, a consequence for those who wielded their authority like a weapon. And she'd be damned if she let it end here. The air crackled with tension as Jack loomed over Charlotte, his broad shoulders squared and his chest puffed out like a man determined to impose his will. The faint hum of the growing crowd buzzed in the background, their whispers weaving a web of curiosity and unease that wrapped tighter around him. With every passing second, his face, already flushed from the heat of confrontation, reddened further as those murmurs swelled into a dull roar. He whipped around to face Charlotte again, his jaw tightening until the muscles twitched beneath his skin. "You think a handful of busybodies gawking at us is going to sway me?" he growled, his voice dropping into a steely edge that carried the weight of a threat. "Either you play along, or we're taking this little show straight to the station." Charlotte's pulse hammered in her chest, a wild drumbeat she could feel in her throat, but she refused to let it choke her resolve. Fear clawed at her insides, a cold, sharp thing that begged her to shrink back, to comply, to make this easier on herself. But she shoved it down, burying it beneath a defiance that burned hotter with every word he spat. "Then take me downtown," she shot back, her voice sharp and biting, slicing through the thick air like a blade. "On what charge, officer? You're blowing this out of proportion because you can't stand being questioned." Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering, a silent challenge that dared him to prove her wrong. Jack took a deliberate step closer, his hulking frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the sunlight around her. He towered over her, his size a calculated weapon meant to make her feel small, insignificant. "Don't push me," he warned, his voice low and gravelly, simmering with barely restrained anger. "You're turning this into a mess when it doesn't have to be." His breath was hot, his presence suffocating, but Charlotte stood her ground, her spine rigid as steel. Inside, her stomach churned a storm of outrage and disbelief, but her face betrayed none of it. "The only one making a mess here is you," she countered, her tone steady despite the tempest raging within. "You're hiding behind that badge, trying to strong-arm someone who hasn't done a damn thing wrong." Around them, the crowd shifted, a restless sea of onlookers clutching their phones like lifelines. The faint click of cameras and the soft hum of recording devices punctuated the air, as their lenses tilted closer, capturing every syllable, every flicker of emotion. Jack's eyes darted toward the devices, a flash of unease crossing his features, but he pressed on, undeterred. "I've had enough of this," he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "If you won't show me your ID, I'll have to assume you've got something to hide." His hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching as if itching to escalate things further. Charlotte's expression darkened, a shadow of anger flickering beneath her calm facade. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow, as a wave of fury surged through her free at his arrogance, at the injustice of it all. "You've already made up your mind that I'm guilty," she said, her voice low but laced with venom. "And we both know why." The words hung heavy between them, a pointed accusation, that struck at something unspoken, something ugly. Jack's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin, hard line as the jab landed. His hand drifted toward his radio, the gesture a silent promise of consequences. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, a crack in his armor. "Look, lady," he said, his voice sharp and cutting, "you think this is about you? This is about me doing my job. And right now, my job is making sure people like you don't stroll off with stolen goods." The words dripped with disdain, and Charlotte's blood boiled. "People like me," she fired back, her voice rising, sharp enough to pierce the murmurs around them. "You mean people who don't match your tidy little picture of who gets to belong here? Who gets to own something worth a damn?" The crowd stirred, their whispers erupting into scattered shouts of agreement, brief, bold bursts of support that fueled her fire. Jack's frustration flared, his eyes darting around as he realized the tide was turning. The situation was slipping from his grasp, spiraling into something he couldn't control. "All right, enough," he barked, his voice booming over the noise. "You can argue until you're blue in the face, but the law's the law. Cooperate, or we'll sort this out at the station." His words were meant to reassert his dominance, but they faltered, undercut by the growing unrest around him. A voice sliced through the chaos, clear and defiant. "You're out of line, officer." It came from a woman in the crowd, her phone raised high like a beacon. She stepped forward, her face etched with indignation, her dark hair whipping in the breeze as she planted herself between Jack and the onlookers. "We're all watching this," she said, her tone unwavering. "She hasn't done anything wrong, and you know it." Her eyes blazed with conviction, her presence a quiet storm of courage that rippled through the crowd. Jack whirled toward her, his anger now a live wire, sparking and uncontainable. "I said back off," he snapped, his voice raw with fury. "You sticking your nose in this isn't helping her." But Charlotte seized the moment, her voice rising above the fray, steady and resolute. "This is what you do, isn't it?" she said, her words cutting through the din like a knife. "You lean on fear and threats to shut people up." "But I won't be quiet," the crowd murmured in approval, their voices swelling into a chorus of support, emboldened by her refusal to bend. Jack's composure unraveled, his face twisting into a sneer as he pointed a trembling finger at her. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think a pretty little speech is going to get you out of this?" Charlotte took a step forward, her confidence unshaken, her heart pounding but her resolve ironclad. "No, officer," she said, her tone firm and unyielding. "But standing up to people like you might make it harder for you to pull this crap on someone else." The crowd erupted, their applause a thunderous wave that crashed over Jack, drowning out his retort. His face burned with humiliation, the red creeping up his neck as he stumbled back a step, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. For a fleeting moment, it seemed he might turn tail and flee, his pride too battered to press on. But then his hand jerked toward his radio again, his voice dropping to a guttural growl. "That's enough," he said, quieter now but no less menacing. "You're coming with me." Before he could act, a new voice rang out, deep and commanding, slicing through the rising storm like a lighthouse beam. "What's going on here?" The crowd turned as one, their heads swiveling toward the sound. And Jack froze mid-motion, his hand still hovering near his radio. Stepping forward with measured, purposeful strides was David Reed, his presence a force unto itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the calm authority of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His captain's uniform was crisp, the insignia on his chest glinting faintly in the sunlight, a silent testament to his rank and the power it carried. Charlotte's shoulders eased slightly at the sight of him, a flicker of relief softening the hard edges of her defiance. Though her gaze never wavered from Jack, David's eyes swept the scene, sharp and assessing, taking in the rigid stance of his wife, the restless crowd with their phones aloft, and the officer standing before her, radiating tension like a coiled spring. "Jack," he said, his voice cold and clipped, "care to explain why you're harassing my wife?" Jack stammered, his bravado crumbling like dry earth underfoot. "Captain Reed," he muttered, barely audible, his confidence dissolving into a puddle of uncertainty. "I was just questioning." David cut him off, his tone icy and unrelenting. "Questioning what?" Because from where I'm standing, this looks a hell of a lot like harassment. I'd love to hear your justification." His words were a blade, precise and unforgiving. And Jack's posture deflated, his shoulders slumping as the weight of David's authority pressed down on him. "It was a misunderstanding," Jack mumbled, his eyes dropping to the ground, unable to meet David's piercing stare. "A misunderstanding," David repeated, his voice slow and deliberate, each syllable dripping with skepticism. "You've turned this into a public circus with no cause." "That's not a misunderstanding's misconduct." The crowd fell silent, the air thick with anticipation as David stepped closer, his presence a wall Jack couldn't scale. Jack's face flushed deeper, a mottled red that betrayed his shame, but he said nothing, his pride warring with the reality of his defeat. David turned to Charlotte, his voice softening, a quiet warmth breaking through the steel. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am now," she replied, her voice steady, a thread of gratitude woven into her resolve. David nodded, then turned back to Jack, his tone firm once more. "You're done here. Step away." Jack hesitated, his jaw clenching, his eyes flickering toward his patrol car as if it might offer an escape. Finally, he stepped back, the weight of David's command and the crowd's judgment too heavy to resist. The onlookers began to disperse, their phones still recording as Jack retreated, his footsteps heavy with defeat. David watched him go, his expression unreadable, then turned to Charlotte. "Let's go," he said quietly, a promise lingering in his tone. "This isn't over." Charlotte nodded, her resolve unbroken, her heart still racing, but her spirit buoyed by the stand she'd taken. "No," she agreed, "it's not." The confrontation lingered in the air like smoke, a testament to the fragility of power when wielded without justice. Jack had relied on his badge as a bludgeon, a tool to bend others to his will. But Charlotte's refusal to break and David's unwavering support that exposed the cracks in his armor. The crowd, too, had played its part, their voices and their vigilance a reminder that accountability could not be silenced. In that moment, the lesson was clear: authority unchecked is a hollow thing, and the consequences of its abuse ripple far beyond the abuser, etching a deeper truth into the fabric of the day. The air buzzed with tension as Jack muttered something under his breath, his voice so faint it barely broke through the hum of the dispersing crowd. "Fine," he hissed, the word dripping with a bitter cocktail of anger and shame. "She's free to go." His head hung low, but the sting of defeat radiated from him like heat off asphalt in summer. David, standing tall and unyielding, didn't budge an inch. His sharp eyes bore into Jack, pinning him in place as if he were a specimen under a microscope. "You'll report to my office first thing tomorrow morning," David said, his voice a low rumble, steady and commanding, leaving no cracks for defiance to slip through. "And you'd better have a solid explanation for the mess you just made. Something that holds water." Jack gave a stiff nod, his jaw clenched so tight it might have cracked a tooth. His cheeks burned a furious red as he turned on his heel, boots scuffing the pavement, and stormed back to his patrol car. The onlookers parted silently, their whispers fading into a heavy, uneasy quiet, their eyes trailing him like a spotlight he couldn't escape. David let out a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that comes after holding too much inside for too long. He turned to Charlotte, and the hard lines of his face softened, his gaze warming with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentler now, almost tender. Charlotte stood there, her posture straight, her chin lifted despite the storm she'd just weathered. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady as steel, though a faint tremor of exhaustion lingered beneath it. "But this has to stop, David. Not just for me, for everyone." He rested a hand on her shoulder, firm and reassuring, though his jaw tightened with a flicker of resolve. "It will," he promised, his words carrying the weight of a vow. "This isn't over." The crowd began to thin out, their phones slipping back into pockets as the electric charge in the air dulled to a hum. A few stragglers cast Charlotte fleeting nods of solidarity or murmured quiet words of encouragement, before drifting away into the evening shadows. As the street emptied, David stole a glance toward Jack's patrol car. The officer sat rigid behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped it, staring straight ahead into nothing, as if he could will the day to rewind. "Come on," David said softly, turning back to Charlotte. "Let's go home." She nodded, though the fire in her hazel eyes still blazed, unquenched by the fading chaos. "We've got a lot to talk about," she said, her voice low, threaded with determination. David met her gaze with a small, resolute nod. "We'll deal with it," he replied, calm but unwavering. Together, side by side, they walked away from the scene, their footsteps echoing faintly against the concrete. For David, this wasn't just a fleeting clash in the street, it was a crack in the foundation of everything he'd built his life around, a moment that would ripple far beyond the fading murmurs of the witnesses. It was a reckoning, one that would force him to confront the justice system he'd devoted himself to, a system that now felt like a machine grinding against its own gears. The front door slammed shut with a jarring thud as they stepped into the house, the sound reverberating through the quiet living room. Charlotte flung her bag onto the nearest chair, the leather hitting the cushion with a dull thwack. She spun around to face David, who was still easing the door closed behind him, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "You're the captain of the police department, David," she began, her voice tight, laced with a frustration so raw it seemed to claw its way out of her chest. "And yet I was out there, forced to stand in the middle of the street, defending myself against one of your own officers. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? How small it made me feel?" David sighed, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of her words pressed down on him. He leaned against the wall, the plaster cool against his back. "Charlotte, I got there as fast as I could. The second I saw what was happening, I stepped in. I stopped it." Her eyes flashed, and she took a step closer, her voice rising like a wave about to crash. "You shouldn't have had to step in, David. It shouldn't have happened at all. What does it say about the department you're supposed to be leading, if someone like Jack feels bold enough to pull a stunt like that in broad daylight?" David's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. "You think I don't know how bad it looked?" I was furious. "Charlotte, he crossed a linea big oni and I'll make damn sure he pays for it." She crossed her arms, her stance defiant, her eyes burning with a mix of hurt and fury. "You'll make sure? That's not enough, David. Do you really think this is the first time Jack's pulled something like this? Or that it'll be the last? What's your plan? Write him up? Give him a stern talking to? Meanwhile, people like me are left picking up the pieces, living with the fallout of his power trip." David straightened, stepping toward her, his voice steady but edged with conviction. "That's not how I do things, Charlotte. I'll handle this the right way, thoroughly, fairly. He won't just skate by." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head as if his words were a bad joke. "The right way? How long have you been trying to fix things the right way, David? Years, right? And what's changed? Today, I was humiliated not because of anything I did, but because of the system you're tangled up in. The system you swore to make better." David bristled, his own frustration bubbling up, spilling over. "I'm not the enemy here, Charlotte. I'm the one who stopped him. I've spent years, decades fighting to clean up that department from the inside. You know how hard it is, how many walls I've smashed my head against trying to make a dent." Charlotte's voice cracked, anger giving way to a raw, aching vulnerability. "And yet here we are. David, after all your time, all your promises about change, I'm still out there being treated like a criminal just for walking down the street, with a necklace on. If this is what happens to Mayor or wife, what happens to the people who don't have you rushing in to play the hero?" David's hands balled into fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening. "You think I don't see that? You think I don't wrestle with it every single day? I fight it, Charlotte, every damn day, and it's exhausting. It's a war one can't seem to win." Her eyes narrowed, her voice breaking under the weight of her emotions. "Then fight harder, David. Because today, I didn't feel like your wife. I felt like just another name on their list, another face they could harass without a second thought. And it's tearing me apart." The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the echoes of their clashing words. They stood frozen, inches apart, the air between them crackling with unspoken pain. David finally exhaled, dragging a hand over his face, his fingers lingering over the lines etched deep by years of strain. "I hate that this happened to you," he said, his voice quieter now, raw with regret. "I hate that I wasn't there sooner. But don't think for a second I don't get it. I've seen this ugliness up close, hell. I've lived it. That's why I took this job. Why I've stayed in this broken system. I thought I could fix it. Charlotte's arms fell to her sides, her expression softening as she studied him, the exhaustion and resolve warring in his eyes. And have you? She asked, her tone gentler now, probing. He met her gaze, his own eyes shadowed with frustration and a flicker of shame. Not enough, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, the admission cutting deeper than any shout. She stepped closer, her anger cooling into something fiercer. Sylv. Then this can't just be another blip, David. Another incident you sweep under the rug. This isn't only about me, it's about everyone who's ever been targeted, harassed, made to feel less than human. You're in a position to do something real about it. David's shoulders remained heavy, bowed by the day's weight, but he held her gaze. What if I can't? He asked, his voice small, vulnerable in a way she rarely heard. What if the system fights back harder than I can push? I've seen what happens to people who stir the pot too much. Charlotte's jaw set, her voice firm, unyielding. Then you keep fighting, because that's what's needed. You have the power to hold people like Jack accountable, to make them face the consequences of their actions. If you don't use it, then what's the point of any of this? Her words hung there, sharp and true, slicing through the fog of his doubt. David studied her, the strength in her stance, the fire in her spirit, and something shifted in him. He nodded slowly, a spark of determination reigniting. You're right, he said, his voice steadier now. This isn't just about use, it's about fixing what's rotten at the core. Charlotte reached out, resting a hand on his arm, her touch warm and grounding. We can't do it alone, she said, softer now, but you've got a platform, and I've got a voice. Together, maybe we can actually change something. David sighed, the enormity of the task settling into his bones. It's not going to be easy, he warned, his brow furrowing. It never is, she replied, her tone unwavering, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it. He nodded again, this time with more conviction, a quiet promise forming between them. I'll start tomorrow, he said. Jack's going to answer for this, and not just him. If there's anyone else in that department pulling the same garbage, they'll know it won't fly anymore. Charlotte's smile grew, small but fierce, a glimmer of hope piercing the gloom. Good, she said, because I'm not letting this go, David. And you shouldn't either. For the first time since the confrontation, a shared sense of purpose settled over them. Fragile but real. The path ahead was murky, fraught with resistance, but they'd face it as a team, united against the tide. The next morning, David sat in his office, the faint hum of the precinct buzzing beyond the closed door. The air felt thick, charged with the tension of what he was about to set in motion. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, the blank document on his screen staring back at him like a challenge. Then, with a deep breath, he began typing, the clack of the keys a steady rhythm. This wasn't just paperwork, it was the opening salvo in a battle against a culture that had festered too long within the Willowbrook Police Department, a culture that had let men like Jack wield their badges like weapons. The door creaked open, and Detective Harris stepped in, his heavy boots thudding against the worn linoleum. A grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual scowl. Harris carried the weight of decades on the force, his cynicism worn like a second skin. He didn't knock, just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, eyeing David with a mix of curiosity and disdain. You really going through with this? Harris asked, his voice rough, skepticism dripping from every syllable. David didn't look up, his fingers still moving across the keys. Yes, Jack's actions need to be dealt with. Harris let out a short, dry laugh, the sound grating against the quiet. Dealt with? Come on, David. We're talking about one messy stop, not some grand crime spree. Don't you think this is a little over the top? People screw you, it happens. David's eyes snapped up, cold and unyielding, locking onto Harris like a laser. Screw up. Jack humiliated an innocent woman, me wife, in a public street. Harris, that's not a slip-up. It's a pattern, a symptom of something uglier. I'm not letting it slide. Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial growl. You're kicking a hornet's nest, Captain. The department doesn't take kindly to internal probes. You know that better than anyone. This'll fracture the team, turn people against you. David leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under his weight, his expression hardening into something resolute. If the team can't stomach accountability, then maybe it's time for a fracture. We're not here to protect egos, we're here to protect people. Harris shook his head, his lips curling into a faint, bitter smirk. You're making enemies, David. Think about your career. Think about how this plays out long term. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor with a harsh screech, his height towering over the desk. I don't give a damn about my career right now, Harris. What I care about is doing what's right. If you're here to talk me out of it, save your breath. Harris held his gaze for a long moment, the air between them taut, electric. Then he shrugged, a flicker of grudging respect buried beneath his gruff exterior. Your funeral, Captain, he muttered, turning to leave, his boots echoing down the hall. David sank back into his chair, exhaling slowly, the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Jack, it was about justice, about the cost of power unchecked, and the hard truth that even good intentions could crumble under a system too stubborn to bend. But as he resumed typing, the words flowing faster now, he felt the stirrings of something bigger, a chance to right a wrong, not just for Charlotte, but for every soul that system had failed. The lesson was clear: power without consequence breeds tyranny, and justice, if it's to mean anything, demands a fight worth having. In the quiet stillness of Willowbrook, a storm was brewing, one that would ripple through the hearts of its people and test the very foundations of justice. Charlotte stood in her modest kitchen, the morning sun spilling through the window, casting long shadows across the counter as she gripped her phone tightly. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the simmering resolve that had been building inside her since the confrontation. She'd spent hours dialing numbers, her voice steady yet laced with urgency as she reached out to those who had witnessed the incident that had turned her world upside down. With every call, the weight of her mission pressed harder against her chest, a burden she carried not just for herself, but for every soul who'd ever felt the sting of unchecked power. One call lingered in her mind longer than the others. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman with a voice fragile as cracked porcelain, had answered hesitantly. I don't want trouble, dear, she'd said, her words quivering over the line. I've lived here long enough to know what happens when you cross the police. People disappear into their own silence. Charlotte could picture her stooped over a worn armchair in a dimly lit living room, the lines on her face etched deep with years of quiet endurance. Her own breath caught for a moment, but she pressed on, her tone firm yet warm, like a hand reaching through the fog. Mrs. Jenkins, I get it, I do. But if we stay quiet, nothing changes. What happened to me's not just my story. It could be your grandson next, or your neighbor. We stopped this by standing together. The silence that followed stretched on, heavy and thick, until Mrs. Jenkins finally sighed, a sound of reluctant surrender. All right, child, I'll tell them what I saw, but you better keep me safe. I'm putting my trust in you. Charlotte's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and responsibility. I promise, she replied, her voice a vow carved in stone. Her next call was to Maya Perez, a firebrand activist whose name buzzed through Willowbrook like a rallying cry. Maya answered on the first ring, her energy crackling through the phone. Charlotte, I've been waiting for this, she said, her words sharp and eager. What happened to you? It's the spark we've needed. The police have been flexing their muscle too long round here, and people are fed up. We'll throw a rally, get the whole damn town out there. The louder we are, the harder it'll be for them to pretend this doesn't exist. Charlotte could almost see Maya pacing her cluttered office, papers strewn across a desk littered with coffee mugs, her dark eyes blazing with purpose. For the first time that day, a flicker of hope danced in Charlotte's chest, fragile but growing, like the first green shoot after a long winter. She thanked Maya, her voice softening with relief, and as she hung up, she felt the faint outlines of something bigger taking shape, a movement born from her pain, fueled by the courage of others. Meanwhile, across town at the precinct, the air was thick with tension, a simmering pot ready to boil over. David, the captain who'd dared to crack open this Pandora's box, had set off a quiet earthquake with his decision to investigate one of his own. In the break room, Jack, the officer at the center of it all, strutted like a rooster, his boots scuffing the linoleum as he ranted to a small knot of loyalists. His voice dripped with venom, each word a jab at the unraveling loyalty he'd once taken for granted. "Can you believe this crap?" he said, pacing tight circles, his hands flexing into fists. "The captain's tossing me to the wolves over nothing just because his wife couldn't handle a few questions. He's making an example out of me to look good." Officer Kowalski, a burly man with a perpetual scowl, nodded eagerly, his meaty arms crossed over his chest. "Everyone knows you didn't do anything wrong, Jack. David's just kissing up to the public, saving face at your expense." Jack's lips curled into a smirk, a predator baring its teeth. "Exactly. He thinks he can play hero. Well, I'm not rolling over that easy." But not everyone was so quick to rally behind him. Officer Johnson, a weary man with nervous eyes, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his coffee cup forgotten on the table. "Jack, maybe it's not all about you," he ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe you did push it to far this time." The room went still, the air crackling with Jack's fury as he wheeled around, his face darkening like a storm cloud. He stepped toward Johnson, looming over him, his shadow swallowing the smaller man's frame. "You saying I'm the problem here, Johnson?" His tone was a low growl, daring defiance. Johnson raised his hands, palms out, a flimsy shield against Jack's wrath. "I'm just saying maybe there's a way to calm this down before it blows up in all our faces." Jack scoffed, turning back to Kowalski with a theatrical roll of his eyes, unbelievable. "You see this? This place used to mean something loyalty, brotherhood. Now it's every idiot for himself." That evening, David gathered his senior staff in a cramped meeting room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a chorus of discontent. He stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders squared, outlining the investigation's next steps with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. He could feel the eyes boring into him, some curious, some hostily, as he spoke of evidence and procedure. Lieutenant Sanders, a grizzled veteran with a perpetual sneer, cut him off mid-sentence, his chair creaking as he leaned forward. "Captain, come on. This is overkill, don't you think? Jack's a solid copier's on the force, no major screw-ups. Are we really gonna gut him over one little slip?" David's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his stubble as he met Sanders' gaze. "This isn't about gutting anyone, Sanders. It's about accountability. If we let Jack slide, we're telling every officer here it's fine to cross that line. It's not." Sanders slumped back, arms crossed, his silence a grudging retreat, but his eyes still simmered with defiance. David pressed on, his voice steady but firm. "We've got bigger problems, sure, but change has to start somewhere. If Jack's actions point to a deeper rot, we dig it out now or we all pay later." The room fell quiet, the weight of his words sinking into the cracks of their resolve. Outside the precinct, Charlotte's efforts were blooming into something unstoppable. The rally Maya had promised came to life under a gray March sky, a sea of faces stretching across the town, square-old men with weathered hands, young mothers clutching their children, teenagers with signs scrawled in bold marker. Charlotte stood at the forefront, a megaphone trembling slightly in her grip as she faced the crowd. "This isn't just my fight," she called out, her voice rising above the murmurs, strong and clear. "It's about every one of us who's been pushed down, ignored, or hurt by a system that's supposed to protect us. We're here to say it stops now, and we won't quit until it does." The crowd roared back, a wave of sound that crashed over her, lifting her spirits higher than she'd thought possible. She scanned their faces, Jenkins near the edge, clutching her coat tight but nodding firmly, Maya beside her, fists raised in triumph, and felt a surge of purpose so fierce it nearly brought tears to her eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was a chorus of voices demanding justice, a reckoning for every abuse of power that had gone unanswered. Back at the precinct, the fault lines were deepening. Some officers whispered their support for David in hushed tones, their nods subtle but sincere, while others gravitated to Jack, their grumbling a low rumble of dissent. Late one night, as the station hummed with the quiet of a graveyard shift, David found a note slipped under his office door. The paper was cheap. The words scrawled in jagged ink, "Watch your back. Some people don't like traitors." He stood there, the note dangling from his fingers, his face a mask of unreadable stone. The threat hung in the air like smoke, but it only steeled his resolve. He knew this fight would draw blood, figurative, if not literal, but retreat wasn't an option. He picked up his phone and dialed Charlotte, the line crackling faintly as it connected. "How's it going out there?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "We're gaining ground," she replied, exhaustion threading through her determination. "But it's bigger than I imagined, David. There's so much anger, so much hurt." He nodded to the empty room, feeling the echo of her words in his own chest. "Same here. It's messy as hell, but we're in this together, right? Always," she said. And the single word was a lifeline. He hung up, his hand lingering on the phone. The fight ahead looming like a mountain he was ready to climb. The next morning, Captain Henry Bennett stormed into David's office, his face a taut mask of barely contained rage. Without a word, he planted both hands on the desk, leaning in close enough for David to smell the coffee on his breath. "We need to talk." Bennett growled, his voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "And I'm not here to play nice." David folded his arms, his posture calm but unyielding, a rock against the tide. "Then say it." Bennett straightened, pacing behind the chair like a caged animal, his boots thudding against the floor. "You're taking this investigation too far, David. One officer, one memento. You have any idea the rift you're tearing through this department?" David's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "I know accountability doesn't feel good, Henry. If it's splitting us apart, maybe we need to ask why that is." Bennett's voice rose, sharp and biting. "Don't pull that holier-than-thou act with me. I've been at this longer than you've been alive. There's a way things work here, and you're stomping all over it." David stood, matching Bennett's fire with his own. "If that way means turning a blind eye to power trips like Jack's, then I'm done with it." He crossed a line, and you know it. Bennett's eyes narrowed to slits. "Keep pushing, and you'll be out on your ass. This department doesn't forgive captains who drag our dirt into the light. You'll lose everything: your team, your badge." David's voice was steel wrapped in quiet. "If their respect hinges on ignoring the truth, I don't need it." The air between them crackled, two wills clashing in a silent war. Bennett shook his head, muttering, "Don't say I didn't warn you," before storming out, the door slamming like a gunshot. That evening, the stakes climbed higher. David and Charlotte returned home to find an envelope taped to their front door, its edges curling in the damp air. David peeled it open with careful fingers, revealing a single sheet of paper. The words stark and menacing, "Drop it or you'll regret it." Charlotte peered over his shoulder, her frown deepening as the threat sank in. "This is Jack, isn't it?" she said, her voice tight with recognition. David nodded, his expression grim as a winter sky. "Yeah, it's his move, slimy and spineless, just like him." Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she snatched it up, her breath catching at the anonymous text glowing on the screen. "Your little crusade won't end well. Stay in your lane." She handed it to David, her eyes hardening into flint. "He's coming for me now. This isn't just about you anymore." David set the phone down, his jaw clenching so tight it ached. It was always personal to him. "Jack can't handle being called out, especially by you, someone he thought he could steamroll. But he's just proving why we can't let this go." Charlotte crossed her arms, her stance defiant. "So what's our play? Ignore it or hit back?" "We document it all," David said, his tone resolute. "Every word, every scare tactic." He's building the case against himself. The next day, Jack's shadow grew bolder. Charlotte stepped out of a meeting with community organizers, her mind buzzing with plans and possibilities, when she noticed a dark car idling at the corner. Its engine purred softly, a predator lying in wait. She didn't recognize it, but the prickling on her neck told her it wasn't coincidence. As she walked to her car, her heels clicking against the pavement, the vehicle crept forward. The driver's window cracked just enough to hint at a presence within, the tint of black veil hiding their intent. Her pulse quickened, a drumbeat in her ears, and she hurried her steps, fumbling with her keys as she slid into her seat. The dark car peeled away with a sudden roar, vanishing around the bend. She sat there, hands gripping the wheel, her breaths shallow until she forced them deep and slow. That evening, David found her in the driveway, crouched near their car, her flashlight beam tracing the undercarriage. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern as he noted the rigid set of her shoulders. She pointed to a faint scratch near the wheel well, her voice steady but edged with unease. "Someone's watching us, David. I felt it today. We're not just fighting a man, we're fighting a machine that doesn't like being questioned." In Willowbrook, the battle lines were drawn, not just between individuals, but between ideals: justice versus complacency, accountability versus corruption. Every threat, every rally, every whispered doubt deepened the story, a tapestry woven with the threads of courage and consequence. For Charlotte, David, and even Jack, the lesson was clear: power unchecked breeds chaos, and justice, though hard won, is the only path to mend what's broken. The fight was far from over, but in the hearts of those who dared to stand, the fire burned brighter than ever. The morning sun cast a harsh light across the cracked pavement where David knelt, his fingers brushing against the jagged gashes in his car's tires. A shadow crept over his face, his brows knitting together as a storm brewed in his chest. The passenger side looked like it had been attacked with reckless fury, rubber splayed open like a wound. "Jack," he muttered under his breath, the name tasting bitter as it left his lips. Beside him, Charlotte gave a curt nod, her arms folded tightly against her body. "Who else could it be?" she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of recognition. "He's not just poking at Eustace, is him flexing his muscle, trying to send us a warning loud and clear." David rose to his feet, his fists curling into tight knots at his sides as he stared at the mangled tires. "It's more than a warning," he said, his tone low and simmering with restrained anger. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. He wants us to shrink back, to drop everything and let him walk free." His eyes flicked to Charlotte, searching her face for a flicker of doubt. But what he found instead was a mirror of his own defiance. She stepped closer, her chin lifting as she met his gaze. "Well, he's wasting his damn time," she said, her words sharp and resolute. "If he thinks this little tantrum is going to scare me off, he's got another thing coming. It only makes me want to dig in harder." David's lips twitched into a faint, grim smile. Their shared determination, a quiet pact forged in the heat of the moment. "We'll report it," he said, "but don't hold your breath for the department to care. Jack's got too many buddies shielding him." Charlotte's arms tightened across her chest, her jaw setting firm. "Then we'll make it so loud they can't ignore it. If they won't move, we'll drag this into the light ourselves." Inside the precinct, the air felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension that clung to every corner like damp fog. Each day seemed to tighten the noose around David's neck, the hostility growing sharper, more palpable. Jack's allies strutted through the halls with newfound swagger, their loyalty to him a shield they wore proudly. Whispers darted between cubicles, murmurs of frustration and dissent that spread like sparks on dry grass, threatening to ignite. Once, David had walked these corridors with confidence, his bonds with his officers solid as stone. Now, those ties were crumbling, fractured under the relentless pressure of the investigation he refused to abandon. The meeting with his senior staff was a battlefield of its own. The room buzzed with unease, every glance loaded with unspoken accusations. Lieutenant Sanders, a weary man with a voice that could cut glass, leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he broke the silence. "Captain," he began, his tone slicing through the room like a blade, "this investigation of yours is ripping us apart. Morale's in the gutter, lower than I've ever seen it, and it's on you." David arched an eyebrow, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Sanders' rising heat. "Morale's low because some of you think rules don't apply," he shot back, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "If holding people accountable is the problem, then maybe the issue isn't the investigation, it's the ones fighting it." Sanders' face flushed, and he leaned closer, his voice climbing. "Jack's been here for years. Sure, he's slipped up, well, hasn't, but he's one of us. You're treating him like some thug off the street when all he did was try to do his job." David didn't flinch, his gaze locking onto Sanders with quiet intensity. "His job is to protect, not to terrorize innocent people. If you can't tell the difference, Lieutenant, then you're part of what's rotten here." The words landed like a gavel, the room falling into a heavy, suffocating silence as the truth hung between them. That night, the air in David and Charlotte's home felt colder. the stillness broken only by the faint rustle of paper. As another letter slipped through the mail slot, this one was bolder, ugly, a crude sketch of a gravestone scratched onto the page. David's name etched in jagged lines across it. Below, the threat sprawled an uneven scrawl. "Keep going, and you'll end up here." Charlotte's breath caught as she stared at it, her fingers trembling slightly before she forced them still. Her face paled, but her eyes burned with a fierce resolve. "He's not even pretending anymore," she said, her voice tight with a mix of fear and fury. David slid the letter into a growing file of evidence, his movements deliberate as he fought the unease gnawing at his gut. "He's desperate," he said. "He feels the walls closing in, and he's lashing out." Charlotte's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "Do you think he'd really do it? Follow through on this?" David paused, the question sinking into him like a stone. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer now, tinged with a rare vulnerability. "But we can't risk assuming he won't." She nodded, her hand reaching for his, their fingers locking together in a grip that spoke of unity and defiance. "Then we stay sharp," she said. "We don't let him scare us into backing down." David squeezed her hand, his resolve hardening. "We'll get through this together." Her voice held firm as she replied, "We will. But we've got to move fast. The longer this festers, the bolder he'll get." A text buzzed on David's phone, the screen lighting up with a message from a fellow officer. "Be careful, Captain. Some of us have your back, but not everyone does." He read it aloud, his eyes flicking to Charlotte as the words settled between them. "It's not just Jack," he said, his voice low and grim. "This runs deeper than I realized." Charlotte's jaw clenched, her expression darkening. "Then we rip it all open," she said. "Every last piece of it." David nodded, a spark of renewed purpose flickering in his chest. "We will, but we need to be ready for the fallout." The courthouse steps were alive with chaos and conviction, a sea of people spilling across the plaza, their signs thrust high and their chants rolling like thunder. At the center stood Charlotte, her figure unwavering, a megaphone gripped in her hand as she faced the crowd. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the clamor. "This isn't just about one bad cop," she declared, her words carrying a power that drew every eye to her. "It's about a system that shields the guilty and crushes anyone brave enough to call it out. What happened to me isn't a fluke, it's a thread in a tapestry of abuse. And it's time we tore that tapestry down." The crowd roared, their cheers a wave of raw energy that crashed over her, fueling the fire in her chest. Cameras swiveled, lenses glinting as they captured her every move, while behind her, activists and community leaders stood shoulder to shoulder, their presence a silent vow of support. "We're not begging for change," Charlotte pressed on, her voice rising with unshakable conviction. "We're demanding it. Justice shouldn't bend for rank or skin color, it should stand firm for everyone." Maya Perez, a fierce activist with eyes that blazed with purpose, stepped up beside her, taking the megaphone with a nod. "Charlotte Reed is carrying this fight for all of us," Maya said, her voice a clarion call that hushed the crowd. "We're here to show she's not standing alone. Together, we can shatter this wall of silence and corruption. Together, we can make Willowbrook a place where fairness isn't just a word, it's a promise." The crowd erupted again, their voices a chorus of hope and rebellion that echoed off the stone steps. Inside the precinct, David hunched over his desk, the dim light casting long shadows across the stacks of files before him. The door creaked open, and Rachel Mears slipped in city, a young officer with wide, nervous eyes and a posture that spoke of hesitation. She lingered by the threshold, glancing back into the hall before shutting the door with a soft click. "Captain Reed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can we talk alone?" David motioned to the chair across from him, his curiosity piqued. "What's on your mind, Rachel?" She sat, her hands twisting in her lap as she took a shaky breath. "I've been hearing things about Jack, about this whole mess. You need to know what's really happening." David leaned forward, his focus sharpening. "I'm listening." She swallowed hard, then plunged ahead. "Jack's been strutting around like he's untouchable. He's got people in here covering for him, fixing reports, burying complaints. It's not just this one thing. It's years of dirt, swept under the rug." David's jaw tightened. a slow burn of anger rising in his chest. "You've got proof?" he asked. Rachel nodded, pulling a small stack of copied documents from her bag. "I've been saving everything I could. I didn't know who to trust, but I can't just sit on this. This isn't why I joined up." David's expression softened, a flicker of admiration breaking through his stern facade. "You're doing the right thing, but it's a hell of a risk. If Jack catches wind of this, he'll target you." Rachel straightened, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready for that. I won't let this keep going." David gave a slow nod. "Get me everything you've got. This could be the crack we've been waiting for." Outside, the rally pulsed with life, but Charlotte's attention snagged on a cluster of men hovering at the crowd's edge. They stood apart, their faces carved with cold hostility. Their eyes locked on her like hawks tracking prey. No signs, no chance, just a quiet menace that sent a chill down her spine. She nudged Maya, tilting her head toward them. "You know those guys?" Maya squinted, then shook her head. "No, but I don't like how they're staring." "Be careful, Charlotte. These things draw all sorts." Charlotte's lips pressed into a hard line. "Let them stare. They won't run me off." She turned back to the megaphone, her voice surging with fresh defiance. "We're here because silence isn't an option anymore. We're here because change won't come unless we force it." Later, in the dim glow of their living room, David and Charlotte sat together. Exhaustion etched into their faces, but their spirits unbowed. Charlotte recounted the rally's highs and lows, her hands gesturing animatedly. When David cut in with Rachel's bombshell, "She's putting herself on the line," he said, "but if her stuff holds up, it could blow this wide open." Charlotte's eyes lit with cautious hope. "That's the break we need. But it means Jack's going to push back harder. He'll escalate if he feels cornered." David's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number flashing on the screen. "Nice rally today. Watch your back." He showed it to her, and her frown deepened. "He's flailing," she said. David nodded, his face grim. "And that makes him dangerous. We've got to stay one step ahead." Charlotte's expression turned to steel. "Then we keep going. If we flinch, he wins." The next morning, Rachel slipped into David's office, a thick folder clutched to her chest. "This is everything," she said, laying it on his desk. "Altered reports, ignored complaints, years of Jack's mess. There's more out there if we keep digging." David flipped through the pages, his anger mounting with each damning line. "This is gold, Rachel," he said, looking up at her. "You've got guts bringing this to me." She gave a small, determined nod. "Just tell me what's next, Captain. I'm in." As she left, David felt a surge of momentum, dialing Charlotte at once. "This changes the game," he told her. "We've got him now, but we can't let it get buried." "It won't," she vowed, her voice crackling with purpose over the line. "Not this time." That evening, Charlotte met with Maya and a handful of community leaders, their faces lit by the flicker of a single lamp in a cramped meeting room. The air was thick with resolve as they plotted their next move, each voice adding weight to the fight. Outside, the world felt heavier, the stakes higher, but within those walls, a quiet strength took root, a testament to the power of standing firm against corruption and the enduring call for justice. In the dim glow of a late evening, Maya Perez leaned forward across the worn wooden table, her eyes alight with a fierce determination that seemed to radiate from her very core. "This is bigger than Jack," she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with the weight of conviction. "It's about dismantling the rotten culture that lets men like him flourish unchecked." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken pain of countless others who had suffered under that same culture. Beside her, Charlotte Reed nodded solemnly, her brow furrowed as she traced the edge of her coffee mug with a restless finger. "We've got the evidence now," Charlotte replied, her tone steady despite the storm brewing within her. "If we push it out into the open, they'll have no choice but to face us." A faint smile tugged at Maya's lips, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. "Then let's make it happen," she said, her voice rising with resolve as the two women clasped hands in silent agreement. As the night deepened, shadows stretched long and menacing across Charlotte and David Reed's modest living room. The sudden glare of headlights pierced through the curtains, flooding the space with an intrusive, blinding light that lingered far too long. Charlotte's heart thudded in her chest, her breath catching as she gripped the armrest of the couch. David, standing by the window, peered out cautiously, his jaw tightening as the car idled ominously before roaring off into the darkness. He snatched his phone from the coffee table, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Rachel Myers. "Keep your eyes peeled," he warned, his voice low and urgent, betraying the unease gnawing at him. "I think Jack's crew is starting to hit back on the other end." Rachel's response came crisp and unwavering. "I will," she said, her tone laced with defiance. "And don't worry, I'm not about to let them scare me off." Neither were David and Charlotte. Despite the creeping threats, the sleepless nights, and the mounting danger, their resolve only hardened, rooted in a shared hunger for justice that no intimidation could uproot. Across town, in the smoky haze of a dive bar's back corner, Jack slouched in a booth, his fingers curled tightly around a sweating bottle of beer. His voice dripped with venom as he muttered, "They think they're untouchable." The words slithered out, thick with resentment, his dark eyes glinting with malice. Beside him, Officer Kowalski leaned in, his broad shoulders hunched as if guarding a secret. "People are already buzzing," he said, nodding eagerly. Words spreading that they're twisting this whole mess into some grand political stunt, painting David as a saint and Charlotte as some tragic heroine. Jack's lips curled into a sneer, a bitter laugh escaping him. "That's exactly what they're doing," he said, his voice rising with a twisted glee. "They're starving for the spotlight, and the department's bleeding out because of it. But I've got a few buddies who won't mind setting the story straight." By dawn, whispers slithered through the precinct like wildfire, morphing into brazen claims. David was a power-hungry opportunist, Charlotte a liar weaving tales of danger for sympathy. Their entire crusade nothing but a greedy grab for fame and cash. One officer, emboldened by Jack's venomous narrative, strutted up to Rachel Myers in the precinct hallway, his sneer sharp as a blade. "Better watch who you're backing, Myers," he hissed, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't want it to sink with them when this all crashes down." Rachel's eyes narrowed into icy slits, her posture unyielding as she met his gaze. "Funny," she shot back, her words cutting through the tension like a whip. "I thought the only thing crashing was Jack's career." With a flick of her head, she brushed past him, her footsteps echoing with a quiet strength that refused to bend. Meanwhile, the pressure bore down on Captain Henry Bennett like a relentless tide. His office had become a war zone of ringing phones and furious voiced angry brass, panicked citizens, and relentless reporters, all demanding answers. The investigation had torn the department asunder, and Bennett felt every fracture like a personal wound. When David stepped into the room that afternoon, the air was thick with hostility. "Close the door," Bennett barked, his scowl deepening as he gestured to the chaos of papers strewn across his desk, his phone flashing with ignored calls. David obeyed, his face a mask of calm despite the storm raging inside him. "What's this about, Captain?" he asked, though he already sensed the answer. Bennett's voice was blunt, edged with exhaustion. "This investigation's shredding us apart. Half my officers are tiptoeing around, the other half think you're leading a witch hunt, and the media's turned it into a damn circus." David's response was measured, his tone firm. That circus wouldn't exist if Jack had been reined in years ago. Bennett leaned forward, his eyes flashing with frustration. "You don't see it, do you? This isn't just about Jack, it's about the department's name, the public's faith. You're dragging it all through the dirt." David's jaw clenched, a flicker of anger breaking through his composure. That faith was shattered the moment men like Jack got away with abusing their badges. "I'm trying to mend it." Bennett's patience snapped. "Your way's a disaster. You're on administrative leave, effective now." David's eyes narrowed, disbelief warring with fury. "You're suspending me." Bennett's nod was curt, unapologetic. "Conflict of interest. You're too tangled up in this. Step back, cool off, let us handle it." David's fists tightened, but he forced his voice to stay even. "You're not protecting the department, you're shielding yourself." Bennett didn't flinch. "Call it what you want. You're out until I say otherwise." Rising from his chair, David's expression turned to steel. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a quiet promise as he stormed out, the door slamming shut with a thunderous crack. Back home, Charlotte sat hunched over the kitchen table, her phone screen casting a pale glow on her tense features as she scrolled through updates. When David walked in, his face taut with frustration, she looked up, dread pooling in her stomach. "What happened?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He tossed his keys onto the counter with a clatter. "Bennett suspended me. Conflict of interest." Charlotte exhaled sharply, leaning back as the weight of it settled over her. "Of course he did. He's buckling under the heat," David paced, his steps heavy with agitation. "They're trying to bury me. Charlottito discredit everything we've fought for." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. A chilling message flashing across the screen. "Careful, Mrs. Reed. Heroes fall hard." She held it up for David to see, her lips thinning into a grim line. "They're not even pretending anymore." He sank beside her, his voice a low growl. "They want us to quit, to let this fade away." Charlotte's gaze hardened, unyielding. "That's not happening." Later that day, Charlotte met Laura Hayes, a civil rights lawyer whose name carried the weight of countless battles against entrenched injustice. The two women sat across from each other in Laura's cluttered office, the air thick with purpose. Laura leaned forward, her sharp eyes studying Charlotte. "I've been tracking your story," she began, her voice warm yet resolute. "What's happened to you is outrageous, but it's also a chance to expose something massive." Charlotte nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "That's what we've been pushing for, but the threats are getting worse. And now David's off the force." Laura's expression darkened, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Retaliation. It's their go to placate you off, make you feel alone. But they're failing, aren't they?" Charlotte's chin lifted, her voice firm. "If anything, it's fueling us." Laura's smile was small but fierce. "Good, this is a war, but you've got me in your corner. I'll take it to court if I have to. We won't let them muzzle you." Relief and resolve washed over Charlotte as she murmured, "Thank you, Laura. We're ready for the fight." That evening, David and Charlotte sat in their living room, poring over the evidence Rachel had painstakingly gathered. The day's blows weighed heavily, but their spirits refused to break. "We've got the proof," Charlotte said, her voice steady as she tapped a stack of papers. "We've got the community behind us. And now, Laura, they're running out of moves." David nodded, though his guarded eyes betrayed his wariness. "Jack's not finished. He'll hit harder. We need to brace ourselves." Charlotte rested a hand on his arm, her touch a quiet anchor. "We will." Together, across town, in a dimly lit diner, Jack huddled with a tight knot of loyal officers. His fists slammed the table, rattling the chipped mugs. "They're not backing off," he snarled, fury blazing in his chest. "And now they've got a damn lawyer." Kowalski leaned closer, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. "Then we show them what happens when they cross us. No more nudges, no more games." Jack's smirk was cold, predatory. "Exactly. They want a war. We'll bring it." By the time the story exploded onto national headlines, Willowbrook was a powder keg ready to ignite. News screens blazed with images of Charlotte at the rally, megaphone in hand, her voice a clarion call for justice slicing through the chaos. Headlines roared, police captain suspended amid officer misconduct probe. Harassment scandal rocks department, a town torn over policing. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, microphones thrust toward activists and officials alike, while civil rights leaders amplified Charlotte's cry, their voices a swelling chorus. What began as her clash with Jack had spiraled into a national reckoning on police accountability. In the town square, protesters flooded the streets, a sea of signs waving high, "Justice for all," "End police corruption," "Hold officers accountable." Maya stood shoulder to shoulder with Charlotte, their chants rising as the crowd pressed forward. "This isn't just a moment," Maya bellowed into the megaphone, her voice raw with passion. "This is a movement. We're here for justice, and not just for Charlotte, but for every soul crushed by a broken system." The crowd thundered in response, their roar shaking the very pavement. Charlotte took the megaphone next, her words sharp and unyielding. "We will not be silenced," she declared, her voice cutting through the din like a blade forged in fire. "Not by threats, not by intimidation, not by a system too cowardly to face its own sins. Change is coming to Willowbrook, whether they're ready or not." As the cheers erupted, her eyes swept the throng, a flicker of pride piercing the weight of her burden. This fight was no longer just theirs, it was a lesson etched in the streets, a warning that justice, though battered, could not be buried, and that the consequences of power abused would echo far beyond the shadows of one small town. The air was thick with anticipation, as countless news cameras swiveled to focus on Charlotte, their lenses glinting like the eyes of a hungry crowd. She stood tall under their relentless gaze, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, yet she refused to let even a flicker of doubt cross her face. The weight of this moment pressed down on her shoulders, a burden she carried not just for herself but for everyone who had ever been silenced by fear or crushed by corruption. She could feel the sweat prickling at the back of her neck, but her resolve was ironclad. She wouldn't crumble, not now, not when the truth was finally clawing its way into the light. Inside the dimly lit confines of the Willowbrook Police Department, Captain Bennett paced the worn carpet of his office like a caged animal. His polished shoes thudded rhythmically against the floor, each step a testament to the chaos spiraling beyond his control. His desk phone buzzed incessantly, a swarm of angry voices waiting on the other city officials, all demanding answers he didn't have. When he finally answered, the mayor's voice exploded through the speaker, sharp and furious, cutting through the stale air. "Bennett, this mess is a wildfire. We've got civil rights groups breathing down our necks, national reporters camping out on our doorstep, even Congress sticking their noses in what in God's name is happening in your department." The mayor's words dripped with exasperation, his tone teetering between disbelief and outrage. Bennett gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening as he forced out a clipped response. "We're handling it, sir." His voice was curt, a thin veneer of confidence masking the turmoil churning inside him. "Handling it?" The mayor shot back, his sarcasm slicing through the line. "From where I'm standing, it looks like your whole operation is collapsing in on itself. Get this under control, Bennett, or you won't have a department left to command." The call ended with a harsh click, and Bennett slammed the phone down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. He clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. The pressure from every corner city hall, the media, his own officers glistening like a vice. He'd tried to smother the investigation, to sweep it under the rug like so many problems before. But the harder he pushed, the more it slipped through his fingers, exposing the rot he'd long ignored. Meanwhile, across town, Jack sat hunched over a chipped table in the shadowy corner of a local diner, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The air smelled of stale coffee and greasy fries, a fitting backdrop for the bitterness seeping into his every word. Kowalski lounged across from him, arms crossed over his broad chest, his weathered face etched with skepticism. A handful of other loyalists flanked them, their postures tense, eyes darting to the door as if expecting trouble to barge in at any moment. "This is nothing but a smear campaign," Jack growled, his voice low and venomous, each syllable laced with resentment. "They're dragging the department's name through the dirt over one dumb mistake, and now the whole country's got its eyes on us, waiting to see us bleed." Kowalski tilted his head, his chair creaking under his weight as he studied Jack with a mix of curiosity and doubt. "So, what's the move? We just sit here and let them bury us?" Jack's lips curled into a smirk, sharp and defiant, his eyes glinting with a dangerous spark. "Not a chance in hell. We dig up whatever we can on Charlotte, on Reed anything dirty. Anything we can twist to make them look like the villains here. They want a fight. We'll give them a war." His words hung in the air, heavy with intent, as the loyalists exchanged glances, some nodding eagerly, others shifting uneasily in their seats. For Jack, this wasn't just about survival, it was personal, a chance to claw back the power he felt slipping away. Back at home, Charlotte sat cross-legged on the living room floor, the soft glow of her phone illuminating her face. As she scrolled through a flood of social media posts, David perched on the couch beside her, his brow furrowed as he watched her intently. The national spotlight had finally turned their way, bringing a surge of hope that mingled uneasily with dread in Charlotte's chest. "They're listening now," she murmured, her voice trembling with a fragile mix of relief and determination. Her thumb paused over a post from a stranger halfway across the country. Words of solidarity that made her eyes sting with unshed tears. People are actually standing with us. But beneath that flicker of optimism lurked a shadow she knew Jack, and his cronies wouldn't go down without a vicious fight. David nodded, his expression darkening as he leaned closer, his voice a quiet rumble. They're already spinning their lies. I've heard whispers in the department talk of false accusations, claims we've got some hidden agenda. Charlotte set her phone down with a soft thud, her gaze hardening as she met his eyes. Let them talk, she said, her tone steely, forged in the fire of everything they'd endured. The louder they scream, the more they show how desperate they are. We've got the truth, David, and that's stronger than their noise. He rested his elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The real question is how far they'll go to bury it. We can't let our guard down out for a second. They won't play by the rules. The next day, Willowbrook's streets erupted into a sea of voices and movement, the largest protest yet swelling through the town like a tidal wave. Thousands poured onto the pavement, their chants reverberating for miles. A chorus of anger and hope that shook the very air. Banners fluttered in the breeze, scrawled with demands for justice, while the faces in the crowd, young and old, locals and newcomers, burned with a shared resolve. Representatives from national civil rights groups had joined the fray, their presence amplifying the movement's reach, turning a small-town struggle into a national reckoning. On a makeshift stage at the rally's heart, Charlotte stood shoulder to shoulder with Maya, her closest friend, and Laura Hayes, the civil rights lawyer whose sharp intellect and unshakable courage had become their shield. The crowd's roar swelled as Laura stepped to the microphone, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade, clear and commanding. This isn't just about one rotten cop or one broken department, she declared, her words ringing with a fierce clarity that sent shivers down Charlotte's spine. This is about tearing down the whole damn culture that lets corruption fester and abuse run wild. We're here to fight, and we won't stop until justice isn't just a word, it's a reality. The crowd exploded, their energy crackling like a storm ready to break, as reporters swarmed the edges of the scene, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward to capture every raw, electric moment. Inside the police department, the air was suffocating, thick with tension that seemed to seep into the walls. Officers who backed David's push for accountability squared off against Jack's loyalists, their arguments escalating into shouted accusations and slammed fists on tables. The rift had grown into a chasm, splitting the department down the middle. In a cramped meeting room, Sanders, one of Jack's most vocal supporters, loomed over Captain Bennett, his face flushed with fury. "You're just gonna let them rip us apart?" he demanded, his voice booming through the space. Bennett shot back, his patience fraying at the edges. "What do you want me to do, Sanders? March out there and start cuffing protesters? That'll only fan the flames." Sanders jabbed a finger toward the window, where the distant hum of the rally filtered through. "Then kill this thing. Find a way to smear them before they ruin us all." Bennett's silence was deafening, his jaw tight as he wrestled with the chaos threatening to swallow his career whole. David, though still suspended, refused to sit idle. In a cluttered back room of a friend's house, he met with Rachel Myers, a whip-smart investigator whose quiet intensity matched his own. She slid a thick stack of reports across the table, her eyes gleaming with a hunter's focus. "They're scrambling," she said, tapping the papers with a chipped fingernail. "The harder they push back, the more cracks we see. Keep the pressure on, and they'll break." David flipped through the documents, his mind racing as he traced the threads of evidence dates, names, falsified logs. "This is solid," he said, nodding, "but we need more. The public's with us now, we can't let that slip away." Rachel hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line before she spoke again. "Watch yourself, David. The more desperate they get, the uglier this could turn." Her warning hung between them, a quiet reminder of the stakes they were playing with. That night, Charlotte's phone buzzed with a new message, the screen casting a harsh glow across her face. The words were stark and chilling. "Enough is enough. Back off, or you'll regret it." She handed the phone to David, her expression calm but unyielding. "A fortress built from every threat they'd faced. They think this'll scare us," she said, her voice steady as stone. David shook his head, a faint, grim smile tugging at his lips. "It's proof we're winning, but it also means we're closer to close for their comfort." Charlotte met his gaze, her resolve blazing bright. "Then we keep pushing. We don't stop until every last piece of this mess is dragged into the open. He squeezed her hand, a silent vow passing between them. We won't. Days later, the conference room at the station felt like a pressure cooker, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Captain Bennett sat at the head of the table, his tie slightly askew, flanked by senior officers whose faces ranged from weary to hostile. David stood near the far end, summoned despite his suspension a clear power play to force him into submission. Bennett cleared his throat, his tone clipped but carefully neutral. Let's cut to it, Reed. This investigation's gone too far. It's fracturing the department, and I don't see the point in dragging it out. David didn't flinch, his stance rooted as he met Bennett's gaze head-on. The point is accountability, Captain. Jack's actions were indefensible inheritance, intimidation, cooked reports. If we bury this, we're saying justice doesn't matter here. I won't stand for that. Bennett leaned forward, his voice dropping, a flicker of frustration breaking through his mask. You're letting your heart rule your head, Reed. I get this hits close to home with Charlotte, but feelings don't belong in this. Drop it before you tank the department's reputation for good. David stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, his words sharp as steel. The reputation's already in pieces, Captain. You're just too afraid to face it. If we back off now, we're greenlighting every thug with a badge to do whatever they want. I'd rather lose my job than let that happen. Bennett's breath hissed out, his composure cracking as he snapped. You think you're some knight in shining armor? You'll bring this whole place down with you. The room went still, the other officers shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two men. Before Bennett could regroup, the door swung open and Jack strolled in, his lawyer at his side. He dropped into a chair with a casual swagger, his smirk dripping with defiance. You wanted me, Captain, he drawled, leaning back as if he owned the room. Bennett straightened, his voice tight. Officer Grant, we're here to address the allegations against you and figure out what's next. Jack shrugged, unfazed. Fine, let's get it over with. David turned on him, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. These aren't just allegations, Jack. We've got proof: misconduct, threats, doctored records. You've abused your power, and it's time you paid for it. Jack's smirk widened, his tone mocking. Proof, or just another witch hunt to pin the department's problems on me? Let's be real. Reed, this is about you playing hero. David's fists tightened, but his voice held steady. It's about the people you've hurt, the trust you've shattered. You're a disgrace to everything this badge stands for. Jack surged forward, his smugness giving way to raw anger. Don't preach at me, Reed. You think you're above it all? This department's been dirty for years. You're just as much a part of it as I am. David's response was ice cold, unwavering. That's where you're wrong. I've spent my career fighting the rot, not feeding it. You're the problem, Jack, and I'm done letting you hide. The room buzzed with murmurs, the air crackling as Bennett barked, enough. His hand shot up, silencing the chaos. Grant, do you deny the charges? Jack's lawyer jumped in, his voice smooth and calculated. My client rejects all accusations. He acted within his duties and has been unfairly targeted by an overzealous crusade. David shook his head, his patience thinning. Overzealous? Jack's got a rap sheet of violations stretching back years. This reckoning's overdue. The lawyer opened his mouth to counter, but the door creaked open again, cutting him off mid-breath. In this sprawling tale, justice emerges not as a gift, but a hard-won prize, wrested from the grip of those who twist power for their own ends. Charlotte and David stand as beacons, their courage illuminating the cost of silence, while Jack and his allies reveal the desperation of a system clinging to its shadows. Every step forward exposes the fragility of corruption and the devastating consequences of letting it fester unchecked. The air in the room thickened with tension as Rachel Myers strode in, her arms cradling a hefty folder that seemed to carry the weight of a dozen untold stories. Her boots clicked purposefully against the tiled floor, each step echoing with resolve as she made a beeline for David Reed, ignoring the sea of curious eyes tracking her every move. She thrust the folder into his hands with a quiet intensity that spoke louder than words. Captain Reed, she said, her voice steady and unyielding, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. This is additional evidence to bolster the investigation. David's fingers hesitated for a split second before flipping open the cover. his breath catching as he leafed through the pages. His eyes widened, darting across falsified reports, internal complaints buried without so much as a whisper of follow-up, and a chilling catalog of Jack Grant's repeated transgressions. The deeper he dug, the heavier the truth felt, like a stone sinking into his chest. He pulled out a single sheet, a falsified arrest report from the previous year, and held it aloft for the room to see. "This," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and fury, "is from one of Jack's arrests. The charges were dropped because the report didn't add up, because Jack cooked up evidence to prop up the whole thing. And this isn't some one-off mistake. It's a pattern." A suffocating silence descended, the kind that presses down on your shoulders and makes your heartbeat deafening. The evidence wasn't just compelling, it was a sledgehammer, shattering any pretense of doubt. Captain Bennett, seated at the head of the table, reached for the folder with a scowl etched deep into his weathered face, his thick brows furrowed as he skimmed the damning documents, his jaw tightening with every turn of the page. Rachel didn't flinch under his gaze. "I've included statements from officers who saw Jack's behavior firsthand," she continued, her tone unwavering, almost daring anyone to challenge her. "They were scared into silence, intimidated by threats, subtle or not, but they're ready to talk now." Jack's lawyer, a weary man with a pinched face and a suit too crisp for the occasion, shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," he barked, his voice dripping with indignation. "These are baseless accusations, a cheap smear campaign to ruin my client's good name." David turned to him, his eyes narrowing into icy slits. "The only thing ruining Jack's name," he said coolly, "is the truth he's been dodging for years." Across the table, Jack's facade crumbled like dry clay. He lurched to his feet, slamming his palms onto the wood with a force that rattled the water glasses. "This is a damn witch hunt," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're all out to crucify me because I don't kiss the ring and play your games. Well, newsflash, department's just as rotten as you claim I am. You're all a bunch of hypocrites." His words hung in the air, wild and unhinged. But David stepped forward, undeterred, his presence a calm storm against Jack's chaos. "The difference, Jack," he said, his voice slicing through the outburst, "is that we're trying to fix it, and that starts with you facing the music." Bennett raised a hand, his face taut with strain, as if the weight of the moment threatened to snap him in two. "Enough," he rasped, his voice rough and weary. Everyone out. The room hesitated, a collective breath held, before people shuffled toward the door, their footsteps dragging with reluctance. Soon only Bennett, David, and Rachel remained, the folder lying between them like a loaded gun. Bennett stared at it, his fingers twitching as frustration and resignation wrestled across his features. "This complicates things," he admitted, his reluctance palpable. "I'll go through it and figure out what's next. But readn't think this means you've got the upper hand." David met his gaze, unflinching, his hazel eyes burning with quiet conviction. "It's not about winning, Captain. It's about what's right." Bennett didn't reply, his attention sinking back into the folder as David and Rachel stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them, and Rachel turned to David, her stern expression softening just enough to let a question slip through. "Do you think he'll do anything with it?" David exhaled, his shoulders loosening as the tension ebbed slightly. "He's got no choice now. The evidence is airtight. Jack's got nowhere left to run." A faint smile tugged at Rachel's lips, a rare crack in her armor. "Then we keep pushing until the whole system bends." David's own smile was small but resolute. "One step at a time." Days later, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a hive of restless energy as people packed the benches. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and nervous sweat, every whisper amplifying the stakes. Laura Hayes stood at the plaintiff's table, her posture radiating authority, her dark suit sharp against the muted tones of the room. Beside her, David and Charlotte Reed sat with faces carved from stoner salute, unyielding, their hands clasped tightly beneath the table as if anchoring each other. Across the aisle, Jack sat rigid, his jaw clenched so hard it seemed his teeth might shatter. His lawyer, Paul Greer, leaned close, muttering urgent words into his ear. But Jack's eyes stayed fixed ahead, hollow and stormy. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, and the room surged to its feet as the judge swept in. Robes billowing like a thunder cloud, the trial began with a hush, the kind that precedes a reckoning. Laura stepped forward, her heels clicking with purpose, and launched into her opening statement with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "This case isn't just about one officer stepping over the line. It's about a culturally rotting foundation that's let power run wild, unchecked, for far too long. My clients, Charlotte and David Reed, aren't here for revenge. They're here to drag the truth into the light, to make sure this abuse stops cold. You'll hear from people who saw Officer Jack Grant's actions with their own eyes. You'll see evidencers of it swept under the rug or outright buried. Today, we're unearthing it all." Paul Greer rose next, his sleek suit gleaming under the courtroom lights, his voice smooth as polished glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone measured but edged with a faint sneer, "my client has served this community with dedication for years. These claims, they're overblown, fueled by grudges and hyped-up headlines. I urge you to stick to the facts, not the feelings." His words were calm, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes, a crack in the mask he wore so well. The first witness, Mrs. Corey Jenkins, shuffled to the stand, her frail frame trembling slightly under the weight of the moment. Charlotte had sought her out after that fateful confrontation, and now the elderly woman clutched the edges of the podium, her watery blue eyes darting nervously around the room. But when she spoke, her voice held a quiet steel. "I saw Officer Grant stop Mrs. Reed that day," she said, her words slow but firm. It was plain as day he singled her out for no good reason. She hadn't done a thing wrong, but he kept at her, piling on accusations, making it worse and worse. Laura offered a gentle nod, her eyes warm with encouragement. "Mrs. Jenkins, did Charlotte do anything to provoke Officer Grant?" The old woman shook her head, her silver curls bouncing slightly. "No, ma'am. She was polite, calm as could be. He was the one riled up, angry for no cause I could see." Greer stood for cross-examination, his posture dripping with condescension as he adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Jenkins," he drawled, "are you certain you caught every detail? Crowded streets can be a mess, hard to trust your memory, don't you think?" She straightened, her frail hands gripping the stand tighter. "I know what I saw," she shot back, her voice unwavering. "And I'm not so old I can't tell right from wrong." One by one, more witnesses took the stand: neighbors, shopkeepers, everyday folks who'd crossed paths with Jack's heavy-handed ways. There was Mr. Torres, a bodega owner with tired eyes and a voice roughened by years of hard work, who recounted Jack harassing a teenage boy outside his store for no reason but a hunch. Then came Ms. Ellie Parker, a nurse with a soft drawl and a backbone of iron, who'd seen Jack rough up a man during a routine stop, her hands twisting in her lap as she relived the helplessness of that day. Each story wove a tapestry of abuse, a portrait of a man who'd wielded his badge like a club, not a shield. When Rachel Myers took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. She carried herself with a quiet fire, her uniform crisp, her dark hair pulled back tightly as if to mirror the discipline in her words. "Officer Grant has a long history of stepping over the line," she began, her voice steady and sharp, slicing through the murmurs. "I've brought proof: falsified reports, complaints that were hushed up, and intimidation tactics to keep people quiet." Laura handed her a file, and Rachel opened it with deliberate care. "This," she said, holding up a document, "is one of many reports Jack twisted to cover his tracks. The real statements were scrapped, replaced with lies to justify arrests that never should have happened." Greer pounced during cross-examination, his tone sharp and accusing. "Officer Myers, you've barely been with the department. How can you possibly grasp the full picture here?" Rachel didn't blink, her gaze locking onto his with unflinching clarity. "I might be new, but I don't need years to know what's right. What I saw wasn't just mistakes, it was calculated." As the trial wore on, Laura built her case brick by brick, each piece of evidence a hammer blow against Jack's crumbling defenses. The air grew heavier with every testimony, every document, until the room felt like it might collapse under the weight of it all. Then came the turning point: a whistleblower from within the department, their identity cloaked in shadow, their voice distorted but piercing. Complaints about Jack were buried, they said, the words crackling through the microphone. Captain Bennett knew Varian did, but he cared more about the department's reputation than fixing the rot. Reports were tossed out, investigations stalled, all to keep the image clean. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, heads swiveling toward Bennett, who sat in the gallery, his face a mask of barely contained dread. Jack took the stand next, his broad shoulders hunched, his uniform suddenly seeming too tight, too small for the man he'd once been. His voice swung between defiance and desperation. "I was doing my job," he insisted, his hands gripping the edges of the stand until his knuckles whitened. "Sometimes that means tough calls. People don't get it, but that's how it works." Laura stepped up, her eyes glinting with resolve as she launched into her cross-examination. "Officer Grant," she said, her voice like a blade, "can you explain why almost every complaint against you targets people from vulnerable communities?" "Just a coincidence." Jack shifted, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "I don't pick who gets flaggity, act on what I'm given," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow, even to him. "And yet," Laura pressed, holding up a stack of reports, "you faked evidence to back up these stops. Is that part of your tough calls too?" Greer leapt up, objecting with a flurry of legal jargon. But the jury's faces told the story doubt had taken root, sprouting into something unshakable. The final blow landed when Captain Bennett was dragged to the stand, subpoenaed and squirming under the spotlight. His salt and pepper hair gleamed with sweat, his hands fidgeting as he adjusted his collar. Laura didn't waste a second. "Captain Bennett, did you know about Officer Grant's string of complaints?" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the gallery before settling on her. "Yes," he admitted, the words scraping out of him. "I was aware. And did you do anything real to address them?" Laura asked, her tone unrelenting. Bennett faltered, his voice dropping. "I thought they were minor issues." Laura arched a brow, her skepticism a living thing. "Minor, fabricated reports, baseless stops, harassment that's minor to you." Bennett squirmed, his polished exterior cracking as he fumbled for an answer. "I made choices to protect the department," he mumbled, but the excuse withered under Laura's gaze. His silence afterward was louder than any defense he could have mustered. By the trial's end, the jury had seen enough. Their verdict came fast. A guillotine's drop. Jack was guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs, a wave of relief crashing over Charlotte and David as they gripped each other's hands tighter. Outside, the fallout was swift. Bennett resigned days later, his legacy stained by the cover-up. His name whispered in hallways with a mix of pity and scorn. In the crisp March air outside the courthouse, Charlotte, David, Laura, and Rachel stood shoulder to shoulder, a small army flanked by supporters and flashing cameras. Charlotte stepped to the microphones, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "This isn't the end," she said, her words ringing out over the crowd. "It's the first crack in the wall. We've started holding people accountable, but the fight's far from over. Together, we'll keep pushing for justice, for what's right." The crowd roared, a swell of voices rising like a tide, and in that moment, the lesson was clear: power unchecked breeds ruin, but justice, hard-won and relentless, can tear it down, one step at a time. The air in Willowbrook buzzed with a vibrant energy, a palpable mix of hope and defiance that seemed to ripple through the streets. Cheers and clapping hands thundered through the crowd, their voices swelling with a fierce determination that refused to be silenced. Word of Officer Jack Grant's conviction had raced like wildfire, barely waiting for the judge's gavel to finish its final, resonant thud against the wooden bench. The news tore through the town with relentless speed. Jack, once a figure of authority clad in a crisp uniform, had been stripped of his badge, his title, his power. He was no longer one of the untouchable protectors of Willowbrook. He was just a man, brought low by his own actions. For David and Charlotte, though, this victory tasted bittersweet. As they stood together in the aftermath, their eyes locked in quiet understanding. They both knew this was merely the opening chapter of a much longer, grueling story. A week later, the community center was alive with anticipation, its modest wooden walls straining to contain the throng of people packed inside. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of eager bodies. and the air hummed with whispered conversations. Charlotte stepped to the front, her posture unwavering, her chin lifted with a quiet strength that belied the storm of emotions swirling within her. She felt the weight of every gaze upon her, a mixture of trust and expectation that pressed against her chest like a physical force. Her voice cut through the noise, steady and clear, as she addressed the sea of faces before her. "We've won a single battle," she began, her tone carrying the gravity of someone who'd seen too much to celebrate prematurely. "But the war stretches out ahead of us, vast and unyielding. What happened with Jack wasn't just one man's failure. It's a crack in the foundation of something much bigger, a system riddled with flaws we can no longer ignore. It's on us now to mend it, to demand more." The room exploded into applause, a roaring wave of sound that crashed over her, but Charlotte raised a hand, her expression firm. The noise died down instantly, replaced by a tense, attentive silence. "This isn't about settling scores," she continued, her voice softening but no less resolute. "It's about forging a new path, about crafting a system where justice isn't a rare gift handed out sparingly, but the bedrock we all stand on." Beside her, Laura Hayes stepped forward, her presence a steady anchor in the charged atmosphere. Laura's dark eyes sparkled with a quiet fire, her shoulders squared as if she carried the weight of the town's hopes herself. She'd been a librarian for years, a soft-spoken woman who'd spent her days surrounded by dusty books and whispered storycental. Jack's abuse of power had jolted her into action. Now she was a force, her voice ringing out with newfound authority. "We're launching the Willowbrook Accountability Coalition," she declared, her words slicing through the room like a clarion call. "This is a movemental living, breathing effort to shine a light on corruption, to stand with those brave enough to speak out, and to fight for laws that protect the vulnerable instead of shielding the guilty. But we can't do it alone. We need every single one of your voices, your hands, your hearts." The energy in the room crackled like a live wire, sparking as people leaned toward one another, their faces alight with ideas. Hands shot up to volunteer, pens scratched across sign-up sheets, and pledges of time and resources poured in like a flood. Charlotte wove through the crowd, her steps deliberate, her words to each person laced with a sincerity that made them feel seen. To her, this wasn't just a cause, it was a promise, one she'd etched into her soul the moment she'd seen Jack's tyranny unravel. At home, David lingered on the edges of this whirlwind, his tall frame leaning against the kitchen doorway as he watched Charlotte's world expand. The table was a chaotic sprawl of flyers, advertising community workshops, brightly colored papers promising change, their edges curling from constant handling. The phone rang incessantly, its shrill tone cutting through the evening as Charlotte fielded calls from activists and legal minds, her voice steady even as exhaustion tugged at her edges. David's chest swelled with a quiet pride, tinged with a flicker of worry. "You're unstoppable," he said one night, his tone warm but threaded with awe as he watched her fingers dance across her laptop keys, drafting plans and emails with relentless focus. Charlotte's lips curved into a fleeting smile, her eyes still glued to the screen. "We've got momentum, David," she replied, her voice low but fierce. "If we slow down now, it'll all slip away, everything we've fought for, gone like smoke." "I can't let that happen." David slid into the chair across from her, the wood creaking under his weight. He studied her, faint lines of fatigue around her eyes. The determined set of her jawand felt a pang of admiration mixed with concern. "You've built something extraordinary," he said, his voice softer now. "But you don't have to carry it all yourself." Her fingers paused mid-sentence, hovering over the keys as his words sank in. "I know," she admitted, her gaze finally meeting his, vulnerability flickering beneath her resolve. "But I've seen how quickly people lose sight of what matters. This has to stay front and center, no distractions, no compromises." David leaned back, his mind racing. He'd spent years battling the system from within, dodging its traps and weathering its betrayals. "Then let's make it bigger," he urged, his voice gaining strength. "We've seen how far they'll go to protect their own. If we want change that lasts, we've got to reach beyond Willowbrook beyond what we can even imagine right now." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, then softened as a deeper determination took root, spreading through her like wildfire. "The next month, The Willowbrook Accountability Coalition threw open its doors to its first major conference, a gathering that pulsed with purpose. The community center transformed into a hive of activity, its walls lined with posters and its air thick with the scent of coffee and determination. Activists with weathered faces and sharp minds mingled with civil rights attorneys in crisp suits, their briefcases stuffed with strategies. Reform-minded officers, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights, swapped stories with locals who'd long felt voiceless. Charlotte stood at the podium for the keynote address, her heart pounding as she gripped the microphone. She could feel the room's energy coiling around her, urging her forward. "This is our moment," she said, her voice rising with a fierce clarity that silenced every rustle and whisper. "Our chance to rewrite the Rulesto, make sure justice isn't just a hollow word we toss around, but a living, breathing reality we can touch. This isn't about patching up a broken system. It's about building something stronger, something worthy of the people it serves." From the edge of the stage, David watched her, his arms crossed and his throat tight with emotion. He'd spent years chipping away at the system's jagged edges, his hands bruised from the effort. Now, standing in the shadow of Charlotte's fire, he saw the truth. Real change didn't come from within the beast, it came from the people. It had failed, rising together to demand better. Jack's conviction sent shockwaves through the Willowbrook Police Department, a tremor that cracked its brittle facade. Captain Bennett, a grizzled man with a stern jaw and a closet full of secrets, tendered his resignation under a cloud of scrutiny, leaving a gaping hole where leadership once stood. Whispers turned to shouts as townsfolk demanded an independent review, their voices echoing through the precinct's sterile halls. Officers who'd once smirked at Jack's bravado now scrambled to distance themselves, their eyes darting nervously as they rewrote their own narratives. But others, like Rachel Myers, found their courage in the chaos. Rachel, with her weary frame and sharp tongue, had been a rookie when Jack ruled the force, her silence a shield against his wrath. Now, emboldened by the tide turning, she spoke out, her words slicing through years of buried truths. One afternoon, she sat across from David in a cramped cafe near the precinct, the clatter of dishes and hiss of the espresso machine filling the spaces between their words. "It feels different," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug, her voice tinged with wonder. "People are finally really talking about the things we've all seen, but we're too scared to name." David nodded, his gaze steady. "Change starts with words," he said, "but it won't take root unless the culture shifts too. That's the mountain we've got to climb." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a mix of hope and doubt. "You've been in this longer than Mado. You think it can be fixed?" David's jaw tightened, his mind flashing to the countless times he'd nearly broken under the system's weight. "It has to be," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "If it can't, then everything we've bled for means nothing." As months rolled by, the coalition's momentum swelled, a river carving its path through stone. Charlotte poured herself into it, her days a blur of meetings and her nights a tangle of notes and dreams. Legislation began to sprout from their efforts, bills focused on transparency, community oversight, and ironclad protections for those who dared to blow the whistle. One evening, as she and David sat in their living room, the glow of a lamp casting soft shadows over stacks of policy drafts, Charlotte looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about walking away from the force?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. David's brow furrowed, his fingers tapping against the armrest as he weighed her question. "Sometimes," he admitted, his tone heavy with the truth, "but there's a part of me that believes I can do more good from the inside. It's a mess, Charlotte, but if I leave, who fills my spot? Someone like Jack." Her eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Then stay," she said, reaching for his hand. "But promise me you won't let them dim what makes you you." He squeezed her hand, his grip a silent vow. "I won't, and you won't let this consume you. The world needs your light, not your ashes." The coalition's work began to bear fruit, slow but undeniable. Local governments rolled out new policies, their ink still wet with the promise of accountability. Community-police relations thawed as citizens stepped into oversight roles, their voices no longer whispers but roars. One crisp afternoon, Charlotte and David strolled through the town square, the air sharp with the scent of autumn leaves. They paused before a mural splashed across a brick wall vivid. Figures of the movement painted in bold strokes, Charlotte's likeness among them. Her eyes fierce and unyielding. Nearby, a cluster of teenagers debated the future they wanted for Willowbrook, their words tumbling over one another in eager bursts. David's voice dropped to a murmur. "They're the future." Charlotte's smile was small but radiant, her gaze lingering on the mural. "And this is just the start." Their story wasn't just about one couple facing down a titan of injustice. It was a testament to the raw, unshakable power of standing firm, of weaving a community into a force that could topple giants. Jack's fall wasn't the end. It was a lesson, a searing reminder that power unchecked breeds ruin, and that justice demands vigilance. Charlotte and David showed that a single spark of defiance, fanned by many hands, could blaze into a movement tone that didn't just curse the darkness, but built a brighter dawn. As their journey unfolded, it laid bare a truth as old as time: when the powerful falter, it's the people who rise, and in their hands lies the weight of consequence, the promise of reform, and the enduring hope for a world remade. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet street where Elijah Brooks sat behind the wheel of his car. He wasn't the kind of man who cared much for what others thought of him, not because he was arrogant, but because he'd spent years forging himself into someone who led by example, someone who carried himself with a quiet, unshakable dignity. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his mind already drifting to the military event he was due to attend, when a flicker of movement in his side mirror snapped him back to the present. A patrol car rolled up beside him, its engine humming with a slow, deliberate menace. Elijah's chest tightened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He knew what was coming. The officer emerged from the vehicle with a measured pace, each step calculated, as though he relished the weight of his own presence. His fingers brushed over his belt, adjusting the holster at his hip in a way that demanded attention, the leather creaking faintly under his touch. Elijah let out a long, weary sigh, his breath fogging briefly against the glass as he rolled down the window. He'd seen this type before: a stiff, purposeful stride, the hand lingering near the firearm, the puffed-up aura of control that clung to the man like a second skin. Too many times, across too many years, he'd crossed paths with men like this, men who wore their authority like a crown instead of a responsibility. "Good afternoon, officer," Elijah said, his voice steady and smooth, a calm anchor in the brewing storm. "Is there a problem?" The officer, as his nameplate read, didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there, sizing Elijah up with a gaze so sharp it felt like a blade slicing through the air between them. His eyes, cold and unyielding, roamed over Elijah's face, searching for something: guilt, defiance, weakness, anything he could latch onto. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Randy finally asked, his tone hard-edged and clipped, cutting through the stillness like a gunshot. Elijah kept his composure, though a faint flicker of irritation stirred deep within him. "Waiting to get on my way," he replied, his words firm but laced with a deliberate restraint. He knew how fast these moments could unravel, how a single misstep could ignite a spark into a wildfire. "Why do you ask?" Randy's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile, more a sneer that barely masked his contempt. "You look out of place," he said, his voice dripping with accusation, ignoring the politeness Elijah had offered like it was beneath his notice. He shifted his weight, planting his hands on his belt so the holstered gun jutted out prominently, a silent threat gleaming in the late afternoon light. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, his mind racing to assess the situation. He leaned forward, moving with deliberate care, and opened the glove compartment. Every motion was slow, intentional, acutely aware of the scrutiny bearing down on him. He retrieved his driver's license, and with it, his military ID cards that carried the weight of his life's work. "I'm Commander Elijah Brooks," he said, his voice steady as he handed over the documents. "An officer in the United States Navy. I'm on my way to a military event. Here's everything you need." Randy snatched the papers from Elijah's hand, but he didn't even glance at them. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest, the IDs dangling loosely between his fingers as if they were meaningless scraps of paper. "Commander, huh?" he said, his tone mocking. laced with a bitterness that Elijah couldn't quite place. "And what exactly brought you to this neighborhood? Looking for something, maybe." Elijah's jaw tightened, a slow burn of frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Officer, I'm trying to understand where you're going with this," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, though still controlled. "I'm fully aware of my rights, and so far, you haven't given me a clear reason for this stop." Randy's eyes flashed, and he took a step back, his hand settling on the grip of his weapon with a casual menace. That sent a ripple of tension through the air. "I give the orders here, Mr. Brooks," he snapped, deliberately stripping Elijah of his title, as if the years of service and sacrifice it represented were nothing more than a footnote. "Step out of the vehicle, slowly." By now, the street had begun to stir. A small crowd gathered along the sidewalk, pedestrians pausing mid-stride, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Some fumbled for their phones, the faint clicks of cameras punctuating the heavy silence. Elijah noticed their stares wide-eyed, uncertain, some brimming with quiet sympathy, but he kept his focus on Randy. He'd faced worse than this, far worse, in places where the stakes were life and death, not just pride. But here, in his own country, the sting of it cut deeper than he'd expected. "Officer," Elijah began, his voice low and measured, an attempt to pull the situation back from the edge. "You're making a mistake. I suggest you stop before this goes too far." Randy didn't respond. Instead, he raised his voice, projecting it not just at Elijah, but at the growing cluster of onlookers. "Get out of the vehicle now, or I'll remove you by force." "That's an order." The air thickened with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone watching. The crowd fell silent, their collective breath held as if the slightest sound might shatter the fragile moment. Elijah's mind churned, weighing his options. He knew how this could anew the stories, the headlines, the lives snuffed out over less. With a heavy exhale, he unlatched the door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace in the face of escalating hostility. "On your knees," Randy barked, his voice now laced with a venom that turned Elijah's stomach. Elijah froze, locking eyes with the officer in a stare that stretched into eternity. Randy's glare was cold, unyielding, a wall of malice backed by the power of his badge and gun. Elijah's heart pounded not with fear, but with a profound, aching awareness of what this moment meant. With no other choice, he sank to his knees on the cold, gritty pavement, the rough surface biting into his skin through his trousers. His back remained straight, his hands clasped loosely behind his head, but inside, a storm raged. Not fear, not even shame, but a deep, controlled fury honed over decades of discipline. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a soft chorus of disbelief and outrage. Cell phone lights glinted in the fading daylight, capturing every second of the indignity unfolding before them. Above it all, Randy's voice cut through like a blade, sharp and commanding, as if he were the victor in some grand conquest. "You think you're special because of that uniform?" he sneered, looming over Elijah, his shadow stretching long and dark across the pavement. "Everyone's equal under my jurisdiction. You don't get a pass because of some military badge." Elijah tilted his head upward, his jaw clenched tight, meeting Randy's gaze with a quiet defiance that spoke louder than words. The crowd had swelled now, a sea of faces reflecting a spectrum of emotion: shock, anger, helplessness. A woman in her mid-30s stood near the edge, her brow furrowed as she whispered urgently into her phone, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Nearby, a teenage boy, lanky and wide-eyed, muttered under his breath, "This is messed up," his words earning a quick tug from his mother, who pulled him back toward the curb with a worried glance. "Officer," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the strain, "you're making a grave mistake. I've given you my identification. I've followed every command. There's no reason to take this further." Randy circled him like a predator stalking prey, his boots scuffing against the pavement with every deliberate step. "You Navy types always think you're above the law," he spat, his words dripping with disdain. "Let me tell you something, this is my street, my rules. If I think you're suspicious, you're suspicious. End of story." Elijah closed his eyes for a fleeting moment, drawing a deep breath to steady the tide of emotions threatening to break his composure. Randy's words didn't wound him, they couldn't, but they crystallized every battle he'd fought, every stereotype he'd dismantled, only to see them rise again in the eyes of someone like this. No medals, no rank, no lifetime of service could shield him from being reduced to nothing more than a target for Randy's unchecked power. The crowd's murmurs grew into a low rumble as Randy pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metal glinting ominously in the dim light. "Stand up," he barked, his voice a whip-crack of authority. Elijah hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to resist, to call out the injustice. But the sea of cameras held him in check. Compliance, for now, was his shield. He rose to his feet, each movement precise, and in an instant, Randy seized his arm, twisting it behind his back with a force that sent a jolt of pain up Elijah's spine. He winced but bit back any sound as the cuffs snapped shut, the cold steel biting into his wrists like a predator's jaws. "Is this really necessary?" Elijah asked, turning his head just enough to catch Randy's eye. "You're arresting me with no cause, no justification. This isn't law enforcement, it's abuse of power. You don't get to tell me how to do my job," Randy snapped, tightening the cuffs until they pinched Elijah's skin. "And I don't owe you an explanation." At that moment, a voice broke through the haze of tension. A woman, young, maybe in her late 20s, with curly hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She stepped forward from the crowd, her phone raised high, the red recording light a beacon of defiance. "This is illegal," she shouted, her voice firm but quivering at the edges, betraying the nerves she fought to conceal. "You can't just cuff someone for no reason. He's done nothing wrong." Randy whirled on her, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Back off, lady," he snarled, his hand twitching toward his holster. "This is official police business." The woman didn't flinch. She planted her feet, her grip on the phone unwavering. "We're all watching," she said, her voice steadying with each word. "We're recording, and we're not going to let you get away with this." Randy's glare darkened, his lips parting to retort, but before he could, another voice sliced through the chaos. "That's enough, Officer Thompson." The crowd parted like a tide, revealing Captain Sarah Martinez, Randy's supervisor, striding forward with a presence that commanded the street. Her police uniform was crisp, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, but her face was a storm of fury and disbelief. Behind her trailed two other officers, their expressions uneasy as they scanned the crowd. The cameras, the scene unraveling before them. "Captain," Randy said, his tone shifting to something defensive, almost petulant. "I was just handling." "Handling what?" Sarah snapped, her voice a razor's edge that silenced the murmurs around them. She marched straight to Elijah, her eyes widening as she took in his face, recognition dawning like a thunderclap. "Oh my God," she muttered, barely audible, her breath catching in her throat. "Commander Brooks." Elijah stood there, still cuffed, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet strength that belied the absurdity of his situation. Sarah's presence shifted the air, a flicker of hope amid the injustice. She turned to Randy, her fury barely contained. "Uncuff him, now." The street held its breath as Randy hesitated, his pride warring with the weight of her authority. The crowd watched, phones still rolling, bearing witness to a moment that laid bare the fragile line between power and accountability. For Elijah, it wasn't just about the cuffs or the humiliation, it was a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked authority, a lesson in justice that cut deeper than any battlefield scar. And for Randy, it was the beginning of a reckoning, a mirror held up to the consequences of wielding power without restraint. The metal cuffs bit into Elijah Brooks' wrists, cold and unyielding, as he stood on the bustling Jacksonville street, his dark eyes locked onto Captain Sarah Martinez's, a flicker of recognition passing between them like a lifeline in a storm. "Good to see someone who knows who I am," he said, his voice steady as a drumbeat, though beneath it simmered a restrained fury, sharp and coiled like a spring ready to snap. The late afternoon sun painted the scene in hues of gold and shadow, glinting off the badges of the officers around him and the phones held high by the growing crowd, their lenses drinking in every tense moment. Sarah's face drained of color, her cheeks paling as if the blood had fled in shame. She whipped around to face Randy Thompson, the young officer standing rigid beside her, his hands still hovering near his holster, her expression hardened, eyes narrowing into slits of resolve. "Take those cuffs off him," she ordered, her voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. Right now, the command echoed off the brick facades lining the street, bouncing back to her with an urgency that made the onlookers hush, their murmurs fading into a charged silence. The tension crackled, electric and alive, as if the very atmosphere held its breath. Randy's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his stubbled skin. He hesitated, his fingers brushing the keys at his belt, reluctance etched into every line of his body. "Captain, I was just," he began, but Sarah's voice lashed out again, louder this time. A whip crack of authority. "Now, Randy." The crowd leaned in, phones trembling slightly in their hands, capturing the standoff as if it were a play unfolding on a gritty urban stage. With a grunt of defiance, Randy finally relented, pulling the keys free and unlocking the cuffs with jerky, resentful movements. The metal clicked open, and Elijah flexed his wrists, feeling the blood rush back into his hands. Yet his posture remained a tower of composure, a testament to decades of military discipline that no petty indignity could shake. Sarah stepped toward Randy, closing the distance until the heat of her anger seemed to radiate between them. Her voice dropped low, a furious hiss that carried the weight of betrayal. "What in God's name were you thinking? Do you even realize who this man is?" Randy's eyes flashed with rebellion, his chin jutting out as he fired back. "I don't care who he is, Captain. He looked suspicious, and I did what I had to do." His defiance rang hollow, though, a thin shield against the storm brewing around him. Sarah's voice rose again, sharp and incredulous, slicing through his excuse like a knife through paper. "Suspicious? You pulled a gun on Commander Elijah Brooks, a decorated officer of the United States Navy, a man on his way to a military ceremony. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The crowd shifted, a collective intake of breath rippling through them as they processed her words. Phones tilted closer, greedy for the drama. Randy stood his ground, though his voice faltered, a crack appearing in his bravado. "I was doing my job." Sarah advanced, her face inches from his, her breath hot with outrage. "No, you weren't. You abused your power, humiliated an innocent man, and dragged this department's name through the mud. Look around you, though. You see how many cameras are on us right now? Do you understand what happens when this hits the internet?" Randy's face flushed a deep crimson, his lips parting but no words coming out, his defiance crumbling under the weight of her accusation. Sarah turned back to Elijah, her expression softening, though guilt lingered in the tightness of her mouth. "Commander Brooks, I am so deeply sorry for what happened here. Please believe me when I say this isn't who we are." Elijah's gaze held hers, steady and unyielding, but his voice carried a quiet thunder when he replied, "With all due respect, Captain, it is who you are." He wouldn't have felt bold enough to do this in broad daylight. The truth in his words struck her like a slap, and she flinched, her shoulders hunching slightly as if to brace against it. She turned to the other officers lingering nearby, their faces a mix of unease and uncertainty. "Escort Officer Thompson back to the precinct," she snapped. "I'll handle him myself." When they hesitated, their boots scuffing the pavement, she barked, "Now." Randy took a step back, his eyes wide with indignation. "You're really going to do this right here, in front of everyone?" His voice dripped with wounded pride, but Sarah's gaze was steel. "Yes, because someone has to show these people that we can hold ourselves accountable." The officers moved in, their hands firm on Randy's arms as they led him away. The crowd erupted into a chorus of murmursome relieved, others outprojected voices blending into a chaotic hum that filled the street. Elijah watched them go, his face an unreadable mask. Though his eyes burned with something deep and unresolved, he turned to Sarah, his voice low and deliberate. "This isn't over." She nodded, her own resolve flickering, but holding firm. "I know, and I'll do everything in my power to make it right." But as the sun sank lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the Jacksonville skyline, Elijah wasn't sure anything could erase the stain of this day. Inside the precinct's briefing room hours later, the air was thick with tension, heavy as a storm cloud ready to burst. Elijah sat at the far end of a scratched wooden table, his back ramrod straight, hands folded neatly before him. Outwardly, he was the picture of calm, a seasoned commander who'd faced worse than this in war zones half a world away. But his eyes told a different story, a tempest swirling within them, fueled by anger, betrayal, and a bone-deep weariness. Across from him sat Sarah Martinez, her uniform crisp but her posture burdened, as if the weight of her badge pressed down on her shoulders like a millstone. To her right was Chief Raymond Harris, a man in his mid-50s with graying hair and a stern, weathered face. His reputation preceded him, a leader who cared more for the department's polished image than the messy truth beneath it. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, a nervous tick he couldn't quite suppress. "Commander Brooks," Harris began, his voice smooth and measured, though it carried the detachment of a man reading from a script. "Let me first express the department's sincere regret for what occurred earlier today. Officer Thompson's actions were unacceptable and do not reflect the values we strive to uphold." Elijah arched an eyebrow, a subtle challenge that hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Regret. The word felt flimsy, a paper shield against the reality of what had happened. Harris pressed on, undeterred. "We've already taken steps to address this. Officer Thompson is on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and I assure you, if he's found guilty of misconduct, he'll face consequences." Elijah leaned forward, his movement deliberate, his gaze locking onto Harris like a predator sizing up prey. "Found guilty," he repeated, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "With all due respect, Chief, there's no if here. There's a street full of witnesses and hours of video footage circling the web as we speak. It's not a question of guilt, it's a fact." Sarah shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, discomfort radiating from her in waves. Harris, though, held his ground, his expression tightening. "We understand that, Commander. But due process. Spare me the excuses," Elijah cut in, his voice rising just enough to carry the weight of his frustration. "I've served this country for over 25 years. I've led soldiers into battle, upheld honor and discipline under fire. And today I was treated like a threat, like my life was worth less than nothing. Thompson didn't just disgrace me. He disgraced your entire department, a department that let him run unchecked." Harris's frown deepened, his jaw clenching as if biting back a retort. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice soft but firm as she stepped into the fray. "Commander Brooks, I hear your anger, and I feel it too. I don't disagree with you. We're committed to handling this thoroughly, I promise you that." Elijah's eyes shifted to her, softening slightly, but losing none of their intensity. "Captain Martinez, I'm grateful for what you did out there, AAM. But this isn't just about today. I won't let this be another incident buried in paperwork and forgotten. Justice demands more than that." The room fell silent, the air heavy with the unspoken. Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair, his stern facade cracking just enough to reveal the strain beneath. "You're right, we can't ignore this. But these cases are tangled, Commander. There's a system, a broken system," Elijah interjected, his voice a low growl. "Let's talk about that. Thompson's not some rogue outlier, is he? How many complaints has he racked up? How many warnings did you sweep aside before he pointed a gun at me?" Sarah's face tightened, her eyes flicking to Harris for a split second, a telltale sign she knew more than she'd let on. Elijah caught it, his instincts honed by years of reading people under pressure. "Captain Martinez," he pressed, "you've worked with him. You're his superior. Don't tell me you never saw the signs." Sarah opened her mouth, her breath catching as she searched for words. Harris shot her a look, a silent warning, but Elijah wouldn't relent. If this department wants any hope of salvaging its reputation, it starts with the truth. "So tell me, how many complaints?" Sarah exhaled, her shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of her. "5, she admitted, her voice barely audible, a whisper lost in the room's oppressive quiet. "In the last 3 years, there have been 5 formal complaints against him: excessive force, racial profiling." Harris stiffened, his face a mask of displeasure. "Sarah, no," he started, but she cut him off, her tone firming with resolve. "He deserves to know. Chief, every one of those complaints was dismissed for lack of evidence. Others because the victims backed off. But that doesn't mean they weren't real." Elijah's lips pressed into a thin, hard line, his anger no longer a simmer, but a rolling boil. Dismissed, he echoed, the word dripping with contempt. 5 chances to stop him. And you did nothing. And now you expect me to trust you'll handle this thoroughly. Harris opened his mouth to respond. But Elijah wasn't done. His voice rose, trembling with a raw, unguarded pain he rarely let surface. Do you know what it's like to give your life to this country to bleed for justice? And equalitarianly to be reduced to a suspicious figure because of your skin? To kneel on that street, a gun at your head, knowing no rank, no service, no sacrifice can shield you from a man like Thompson's assumptions? The room went still, the weight of his words sinking into every corner, pressing down on them all. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the table. Harris looked away, his stern facade crumbling into something weary and defeated. Outside, the Jacksonville night deepened, the city lights flickering like distant stars against the darkening sky. But inside, the storm raged on, a storm of justice denied, power misused, and the long, hard road to accountability stretching out before them all. Rocking the boat, fear of ruining my career, fear of being ostracized. I told myself I was doing enough by keeping my head down and trying to change things from the inside. But that was a coward's excuse. I see that now. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Fear doesn't erase the damage done. Sarah, people suffered, real people, not just names in a file. You had a responsibility. I know, she said, her voice breaking, and I failed them. I failed you. But I'm here now, and I meant what I said yesterday. I'll do everything I can to make this right. Starting with supporting your call for an investigation. I've already spoken to the deputy chief. I'm prepared to testify, to turn over whatever I have access to. I don't care what it costs me anymore. Elijah studied her for a long moment, weighing her words. He could see the guilt in her eyes. The shift in her posture. She wasn't the same person who'd sat silently across from him in that precinct room. Still, trust was hard won, and he wasn't ready to let his guard down completely. Words are cheap, he said finally. If you're serious, prove it. Back up what you say with action. The people out there, he nodded toward the growing crowd of protesters. They're watching. I'm watching. Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. I will, I promise. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He turned his head slightly, looking out at the sea of facemen, women and children holding signs, chanting for justice. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him, but it also fueled him. This wasn't just about Thompson or Harris or even Sarah anymore. It was bigger than any one person. Start by getting that file back to me, he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The one I walked out with, it's only a piece of the puzzle. If you've got access to more, I need it. All of it. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. There's a lot buried: records, internal reviews, things that never made it to the public. It won't be easy to dig up, and Harris won't like it. Harris doesn't get a vote anymore, Elijah replied sharply. He lost that privilege when he signed off on letting Thompson stay on the streets. You want to make this right. Get me the truffle of it. Then we'll see where you stand. Sarah met his gaze, a flicker of resolve hardening her features. Okay, I'll get it to you. Whatever it takes. Elijah gave a curt nod, then turned to walk away. He didn't need to say more. Sarah knew what was at stake, and he'd given her a chance to prove herself. As he rejoined the crowd, a young woman stepped forward, holding out a microphone with a local news station's logo on it. Commander Brooks, she said, her voice urgent but respectful. What's your next step? You've called for an investigation, but people want to know, how do you plan to hold the department accountable? Elijah paused, glancing at the crowd before answering. The next step is making sure the truth comes out, not just about Officer Thompson, but about every officer and leader who enabled him. I've got evidence in my hands. He tapped the file he still carried, and I'll make sure it gets to the right people, independent investigators, journalists, anyone who'll listen. This isn't about revenge. It's about breaking a cycle that's gone on too long. The reporter nodded, scribbling notes. And what about Chief Harris? Do you think he'll step down? Elijah's jaw tightened. That's not my call to make. But if he's smart, he'll see the writing on the wall. The people out here, he gestured to the protesters, they're not going away. Neither am I. The crowd erupted in cheers again, and Elijah stepped back, letting the energy of their support wash over him. He wasn't naive. He knew the road ahead would be brutal. Harris and the department wouldn't go down without a fight, and there'd be plenty of pushback from those who wanted to protect the status quo. But as he looked out at the faces around him, at Donna standing off to the side with a proud, worried smile, he felt a clarity he hadn't in years. This was his fight, and he wasn't backing down. On a quiet evening, Elijah Brooks slumped into the worn wooden chair on his porch, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his spirit flickering with a newfound resolve. The day had stretched long and merciless, filled with whispers of doubt that clawed at his mind, fear of losing his job, fear of defying the unspoken rules that governed his world. For too long, those fears had clouded his judgment, dimming the sharp line between right and wrong until it blurred into a haze of self-preservation. He'd stayed silent when he should have spoken, turned away when he should have stood firm. But now, as the cool breeze brushed against his skin, he felt the weight of that cowardice lift, replaced by something fear-cheered determination to act, no matter the cost. Earlier that day, he'd met Sarah Martinez in a dimly lit corner of the precinct, a place where shadows clung to the walls like secrets. She stood before him, her posture stiff with years of authority, but her eyes betrayed a storm of conflict. Elijah tilted his head, his voice low but steady. "So, what's your next move, Sarah?" Her response came slowly, as if she were unearthing it from some buried place within herself. She straightened, her shoulders squaring as a spark of defiance ignited in her gaze. "I've already begun," she said, her words trembling with the weight of what she'd done. "This morning, I sent a full statement to the state attorney's office. Every detail I know about Thompson, his record, the cover-ups, the department's refusal to act, it's all there. And I'm stepping down as captain." Elijah's breath caught, his eyes widening just enough to reveal his surprise. "You're walking away?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. Sarah shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Not walking away, taking accountability. I'm clearing the path for someone who'll lead with honor, not fear. But before I go, Elijah, I'm in this with you. Whatever you need for that investigation, I'll stand behind you." Her voice grew firm, a promise carved from the ruins of her former self. Elijah studied her, his gaze tracing the lines of exhaustion and resolve etched into her face. After a long, heavy silence, he nodded. "Thank you, Sarah." She offered a faint, bittersweet smile, the title of captain slipping away like dust in the wind. "Just Sarah now," she murmured. "I don't deserve the rank anymore." They parted in silence, two souls bound by a shared reckoning, their footsteps echoing down separate paths. Back on his porch, Elijah's mind churned as he replayed the day. The fight ahead loomed like a storm on the horizon, resistance from the department, a fleeting media spotlight, and the slow grind of change that might take years to root. Yet, for the first time, he glimpsed a flicker of hope, a fragile thread of possibility weaving through the chaos. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the weathered boards, his wife Donna stepped outside, her presence a quiet anchor. She carried two steaming mugs of coffee, the rich aroma curling into the crisp air. Settling beside him, she handed him one, her eyes soft but searching. They sat in companionable silence until his phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. An email notification glowed on the screen. An investigative journalist, someone who'd dug up damning records on Thompson and other officers with buried histories of abuse. The message was a lifeline, an offer to collaborate and expose the rot festering within the department. Elijah's grip tightened around the mug, his resolve hardening like steel. This wasn't just about justice for himself anymore, it was about shielding others from the pain he'd endured, about tearing down a system that thrived on silence. Meanwhile, across town, Randy Thompson sat alone in a sterile, windowless room at the precinct. The air was thick with the stale scent of defeat. His badge and gun, once symbols of his untouchable power, had been stripped away, leaving him exposed, diminished. The walls seemed to press closer with every passing minute, their blank surfaces reflecting the unraveling of his world. For years, he'd wielded his authority like a blade, cutting down anyone who dared to challenge him. He'd believed himself invincible, a king in a kingdom of fear. But now, as the murmur of public outrage seeped through the concrete, he felt the ground shift beneath him. His chest tightened with a sensation he hadn't known in decadus vulnerabili. The internal investigation was only the beginning. The city's fury was a tidal wave he couldn't outrun. For the first time, Randy understood that power, when abused, carried a prisione he was now forced to pay. In another corner of the precinct, Chief Harris stood motionless, staring at his reflection in a darkened glass window. The man looking back was a stranger, hollow-eyed, burdened by the weight of his own choices. He'd known about Thompson's file, the complaints buried under layers of bureaucracy, the whispers he'd dismissed to protect his own legacy. Now, those secrets had clawed their way to the surface, unleashed by Elijah's relentless demands for truth. Harris's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his desk, the realization sinking in. His reign was over. The department he'd ruled was crumbling, its foundations eroded by corruption he'd allowed to fester. Yet, in that collapse, he saw a glimmer of something new, a chance for the system to be rebuilt. Cleansed of the sins he'd ignored, it was a bitter lesson in justice, one that cost him everything. 2 months had passed since the incident outside the cafe in Arlington Hills, a fleeting moment of brutality that had ignited a firestorm across Jacksonville. What began as a single injustice had swelled into a movement, its echoes rippling far beyond the city's borders. On a brisk November morning, Elijah found himself on the stage of the Jacksonville Civic Center, surrounded by a tapestry of voiceless activists with clenched fists, military leaders in crisp uniforms, community organizers with weary but determined smiles. The auditorium buzzed with energy, hundreds of faces filling the seats while countless others watched online, their collective hope a palpable force. Elijah adjusted the microphone, his fingers brushing against the cool metal as the room fell into a hushed reverence. He scanned the crowd, recognizing faces from protests, late-night strategy sessions, and quiet conversations over coffee. Each one carried a story, a reason to be here, a demand for something better. "Good morning," he began, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness. "Before we dive in, I need to take us back. 2 months ago, I was just another name on a long list of people who've been humiliated, stripped of their dignity, treated like their lives don't matter. I was lucky walked away. Too many others, people who look like me, didn't." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle like stones in still water. "This isn't about me, though. It never was. It's about them voices we've lost, the ones we have to lift up." The room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that crashed over him, but he raised a hand, quieting the tide. "Since that day, I've watched this city knit itself together in ways I never thought possible. We've marched, we've shouted, we've demanded answers, and we're starting to get them. It's not enough yet, but it's a beginning." He gestured toward the edge of the stage, where Sarah Martinez stood, her presence understated, but unshakable. "Take Sarah Martinez," he said, his voice softening with respect. "She was part of the machine once, a captain who could have stayed quiet. But she didn't. She stepped up, owned her mistakes, and walked away from her title to fight for something real. She's proof that justice starts when we stop hiding from ourselves." Sarah dipped her head, her face a mask of quiet pride and lingering regret. The crowd clapped again, a swell of appreciation for her sacrifice. Elijah pressed on, his tone steady as stone. "In the last 2 months, we've forced an independent investigation into this department. It's already peeling back decades of roadibus, corruption, things we all felt but couldn't prove. Officers like Randy Thompson aren't just facing charges. They're facing the end of a system that propped them up. And that system's coming down, brick by brick, because of everyone here, everyone watching, everyone who's done screaming into the void." The audience rose to their feet, their cheers a thunderous roar. But Elijah waved them down once more. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, raw with emotion. "Change isn't quick. It's messy, it hurts, and sometimes it feels like you're pushing a boulder uphill just to watch it roll back. But it's real, it's ours, and it starts when we hold each other to the fire, when we demand justice, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's been crushed under the weight of power gone wrong." He stepped back, the room exploding into sound, and for the first time in weeks, a small, Genuine smile broke across his face. It wasn't victor in it yet, but it was a stride forward, a crack in the wall of indifference. That night, Elijah returned to the porch, the familiar creak of the boards welcoming him home. Donna was waiting, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the porch light, 2 mugs cradled in her hands. She passed him one, the warmth seeping into his palms as he sank into the chair beside her. "You were incredible today," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've got a way of pulling people in, making them believe." Elijah chuckled, the sound rough with fatigue. "It wasn't me, Donna. It was all of us people who showed up, the ones who've been carrying this fight. I'm just a piece of it." She reached over, her hand resting on his arm, her touch a quiet reminder of her unwavering faith. "Maybe, but it's always bigger with you. Just don't forget to breathe, okay?" He nodded, leaning back, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I will," he promised, and for a fleeting moment, peace settled over him, a fragile, precious thing he knew wouldn't last, but enough to carry him through the night. Across town, Sarah Martinez sat in a modest office, the desk cluttered with papers and the faint hum of a new beginning. After resigning, she'd taken a role at a non-profit focused on police accountability, a job that felt like both a lifeline and a penance. The work was daunting, but it fit her like a glove. Was no longer enforcing rules, but rewriting them, building bridges where she'd once burned them. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A text from Elijah. "Thank you for everything. Keep pushing." She smiled, her fingers tapping out a reply. "You too. We're just warming up." The road ahead was long, but she felt lighter, unburdened by the title she'd shed and fueled by the chance to make amends. At the Jacksonville Police Department, the air crackled with change. Chief Harris was gone, his resignation a forced surrender to the investigation's revelations. In his place stood a new chief, a woman of color from a nearby city, her reputation forged in reform and resilience. The precinct buzzed with overhaul, training revamped, oversight committees rising from the ashes, policies on force rewritten line by line. It wasn't perfect from it, but it was a reckoning, a testament to the cost of unchecked power and the slow, painful birth of justice. For Elijah, Sarah, and the countless others who'd fought, it was a fragile victory, a lesson carved in the city's bones. When power forgets its purpose, the people will rise to remind it. The winds of change blew faintly through the crumbling walls of a system long overdue for reckoning. Yet progress crept along at a pace that tested the patience of even the most steadfast souls. For decades, the air had been thick with despair, a suffocating shroud that choked out any flicker of optimism. But now something stirred, a fragile, trembling hope that refused to be extinguished, glowing like a lone ember in a sea of ash. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep the weary pressing forward, their eyes fixed on a horizon that finally seemed within reach. For Randy Thompson, however, that horizon had vanished, swallowed by the wreckage of a life he'd once held with ironclad certainty. His world had collapsed in a deafening spiral, each piece of his identity stripped away with ruthless precision. The department, once his fortress, had turned its back on him, casting him out like a pariah. His badge polished with pride for years, Snow sat in some evidence locker, a relic of a man who no longer existed. His gun, an extension of his authority, was gone too, leaving his hands empty and trembling. The charges against him were a litany of sins, multiple counts of abusing the power he'd wielded so carelessly, falsifying reports to cloak his misdeeds, and unleashing excessive force on those he'd sworn to protect. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow, shattering the image he'd built of himself as a guardian. Now, he was something else entirely, a living emblem of the corruption and brutality that festered within, the very system so many fought to tear down. As he awaited trial, Randy sat alone in a dingy apartment, the silence pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. The walls, stained with years of neglect, seemed to close in, whispering accusations he couldn't escape. His former colleaguesmen and women he'd once called brothers and sisters had abandoned him without a second glance, their loyalty evaporating the moment the spotlight turned on his crimes. He replayed the moments that led him here, the adrenaline-soaked nights, the split-second decisions, the intoxicating rush of control. He'd convinced himself it was justice, that the ends always justified the means. But now, Staring into the void of his own making, he felt the hollow ache of regret gnawing at him. The lesson was brutal and unyielding. Power, when twisted and abused, didn't just destroy its victims, it devoured its wielder too. Months later, across town, Elijah stood before a full-length mirror, his reflection framed by the soft morning light spilling through the window. His fingers fumbled with the silk of his tie, smoothing it into a perfect knot with a precision that belied the storm of emotions swirling within him. Today was no ordinary day. He was bound for Washington, D.C., where a congressional committee awaited his voice, a voice that had grown hoarse from years of shouting into the wind, demanding reform, pleading for justice. The invitation was an honor, yes, but to Elijah, it was far more than that. It was a megaphone, a chance to amplify the cries of the unheard, to chip away at the monolith of apathy that had loomed over them for too long. His chest swelled with a mix of pride and trepidation as he adjusted the tie one last time, the fabric cool against his skin. From the doorway, Donna watched him, her silhouette soft against the warm glow of the hall. "You look good," she said, her voice carrying a smile that reached her eyes. There was a tenderness there, a quiet strength that had anchored Elijah through the darkest days. He turned to her, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Thanks. You think they're ready for me?" His tone was light, but beneath it lay a steely resolve, a fire that had burned steadily since the first protest he joined all those years ago. Donna let out a low chuckle, her amusement dancing in the air. "Oh, they don't stand a chance." Her words were a balm, soothing the jagged edges of his nerves. Elijah crossed the room into strides, pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek, the familiar scent of her lavender perfume grounding him. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out into the crisp morning, the door clicking shut behind him like the sound of a chapter turning. The streets outside buzzed with the hum of a city waking up, cars honking, pedestrians weaving through their routines, the distant wail of a siren cutting through the din. Elijah's polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked, each step a testament to the miles he'd already traveled in this fight. The weight of it all pressed against his shoulders, the sleepless nights drafting speeches, the faces of those lost to the system's cruelty, the endless meetings with organizers who'd become his second family. There was Sarah, the young activist with a voice that could rally a crowd in seconds, her eyes blazing with a fury born of loss. And Marcus, the grizzled veteran who'd seen too much but never stopped showing up, his hands calloused from years of holding signs. They weren't just colleagues, they were the heartbeat of this movement, each one carrying scars that deepened their resolve. Back at home, Donna lingered in the doorway a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the space where Elijah had stood. She wasn't one for the spotlight, never had been, but her pride in him was a quiet force, steady and unshakable. She remembered the early days when he'd come home exhausted, his voice raw from chanting, his clothes stained with sweat and tear gas. She'd patched him up, listened to his frustrations, and held him when the weight of it all threatened to break him. Now, as she turned back into the house, she felt a flicker of hope too, not just for Elijah, but for the world he was trying to build. The fight was far from over. Elijah knew that as he boarded the train to D.C., the countryside blurring past the window in streaks of green and gold. Every victory was tempered by the battles still ahead, every step forward shadowed by the ghosts of those left behind. But as the Capitol dome came into view, rising against the horizon like a beacon, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time, the scales seemed to tip just slightly in their favor. It wasn't a landslide, not yet, but it was momentum. And for a man who'd spent years pushing against an immovable wall, that was enough to keep going. Randy's fate, meanwhile, hung in the balance, a stark reminder of the consequences awaiting those who betrayed the trust placed in them. His trial loomed like a storm cloud, dark and inevitable, promising a reckoning that would ripple far beyond his own ruin. Justice, Elijah thought as he stepped onto the platform in D.C., wasn't just about punishment, it was about dismantling the machinery that enabled men like Randy to thrive. It was about building something better from the ashes. And as he straightened his tie once more, ready to face the committee, he carried that truth with him. Power unchecked was a poison, but hope, tempered by struggle, was the antidote.